And again, I am Carlos Alberto Montero, and I work for the Directory of Research of the National University, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. We have a panel with the 7 presentations, so we have much time, as you can imagine. And the idea is to give the floor to these 7 people, and they all have 15 minutes for the presentations. We're going to listen to the first 4 presentations, and then we'll open a Q&A session. After this, then we'll continue with the other 3 presentations. For the purposes of being able to broadcast this panel, I will kindly ask the speakers to use the microphone. And the same for people who would like to ask a question. Please use the microphone at all times in order for people to be able to listen to all the comments here. I am going to introduce the panel members. We have Alejandra Mata and Nancy Ariza with us. They will talk about biomonitoring of emerging pollutants in coastal areas in Costa Rica. Alejandra Mata is Costa Rican, and she works at the Technological Institute of Costa Rica, and she took part of the ECOMAR project, where they analyzed the presence of emerging pollutants, including pharmaceuticals, in marine organisms. We will also have the participation of Taylor McLean Clerk. She, she will be making 2 presentations, one on reef fish on the Pacific, 2 decades following climate change, and also she will talk about eutrophication at the coast and heat waves in the Gulf of Nicoya. She works at Maravilha and CIMAR, and in addition, she started working on fisheries at the research unit of CIMAR from the University of Costa Rica, mainly doing some field lab work for the artisan and other types of fishing. And now she is working with climate change modeling for the impact, and she works mainly on computers. So, thank you. We also have Roy Sarabia. I don't know if he's here yet. He's not here yet. And then he will be talking about the molecular identification of gill fish in Costa Rican markets. Luis de Francisco Sarabia works for the Costa Rican Federation of Fisheries with experience in the application of molecular tools for the conservation. We will also have Maria Laura Sandoval about how to restore reef corals, finding refuge in a sea of uncertainty. And Maria Laura works for the Raising Coral Association in Costa Rica, and she is a biologist with emphasis on coastal ecosystems, and currently she is studying a master's in community development in sustainable management, and she also works on restoring reef corals at the and she also works in marine conservation. We also have Alison Centeno. Alison? No. She will be talking about biology, and she works for FECOP, and she has analyzed the fishing data, monitoring of marine ecosystems, and scientific disclosure. We also have Chantal Rodriguez and Felipe Thomas Alvarez with us. Felipe Thomas, particularly, he is a marine biologist on fisheries management with a vast experience in marine conservation monitoring on biodiversity, working with the local communities on artisan fishing. And she's currently a program director for INUSEA in Costa Rica. We will be talking about INUSEA, a platform that inspires protection for the tropical Costa Rican Pacific. We have a very interesting panel, and we'll start with Alejandra Mata on the biomonitoring of emerging pollutants in coastal areas in Costa Rica. You have 15 minutes. I'll let you know when you're running out of time. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing fine. And I will be talking to you about biomonitoring of emerging pollutants in Costa Rica's coastal areas. To start, we will take a look at the context of my presentation. We will first talk about the concept of emerging pollutants. Then we'll talk about pharmaceuticals as emerging contaminants. Then we'll talk about the background in our country in relation to this type of research. Then we'll talk about the EPOMAR project, the methodology used for this research, and last we'll take a look at the results obtained. To start, it's important to be clear about what emerging pollutants are. Compounds of different origin and chemical nature whose presence in the environment and the possible damage they could cause have gone unnoticed because not to talk about the environmental concentration. There are over 20 types of emerging pollutants that are qualified based on their origin. We have pharmaceuticals, we have personal care products, food additives, hormones, and other compounds that are generated mainly by human activities. This type of contaminants can come to the environment from either point or non-point sources. And the point sources are those in which we can identify the point of origin or when they were released. And in general, these are very concentrated. As an example, we have residual water, and we also have non-point sources, which are those in which we cannot link the point of origin, and they cover vast areas, such as agricultural runoff, or when we have floods as a result of the rain. And in spite of the fact of the sources, when we compare them with the point sources and we have low concentrations, they cannot be linked to the origin. It's harder to control and measure how they can pollute the environment. As I mentioned, a type of emerging contaminants are pharmaceutical products. These are biologically active compounds that aim to cure and prevent the spread of diseases, as well as to improve the quality of life of living beings. And given this, the consumption has increased as the years go by because of the increasing population, and also because of the and on behalf of the population, it has resulted in compounds being emerging as contaminants for the environment, and they are quickly to grow. And it's important to mention that pharmaceuticals come mainly from aquatic through solid waste because many of these do not receive the adequate treatment in order to remove these type of contaminants or pollutants. There have been studies have been conducted in effluents and tributaries, wastewater treatment plants, and in addition to surface water. Have been able to determine the presence of this type of compounds. So for this type of fabric, quite all the research that has been conducted, we have not seen the impact of this type of compounds on marine ecosystems, which is a concern because much of this pollution reaches the coastal areas because of the types of activities like tourism and aquaculture. And also, these types of compounds result in marine organisms having been continuously exposed to this type of compound that led to constant exposure to aquatic organisms, and they start to like this, resulting in a change in their behavior and development. That's the reason why we created the ECMAR project. It is a project that is financed by the European Union, and we have participation for public universities in the countries, namely Universidad de Costa Rica, Universidad Nacional, and the Technological Institute of Costa Rica, and the last was in charge of the coordination of this project. We also had a participation of two other international universities, the University of Montpellier in France and the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And for this presentation, we'll concentrate on one of the goals that we had as part of this project, which was the selection of these emerging pollutants in the tissue of oysters and mussels in the Gulf of Nicoya. And as I mentioned, the, this took place in the Gulf of Nicoya, particularly Paquera, Isla Chira, and Punta Cuchillo, where we have associations that produce these types of organisms. And in addition to these organisms being mussels and oysters, because they fed through infiltration, so they have the capacity of absorb these. And that's the reason why oftentimes these organisms are used as biomarkers or indicators of pollution in the environment because they can concentrate these types of substances. Once we selected these organisms and the area of the study, we selected the analytes for which we conducted a data analysis on the drug or pharmaceutical consumption during the 2021-2022 period. And for this, we took into consideration three main sources of information, the first of which was gathering the consumption of drugs and pharmaceutical products at the Traduccion Hospital in Nicoya, Dr. Todano Hospital in Liberia, and Monsignor Sanabria Hospital in Punta Arenas. The second source of information was it, the carrying out a service for this area of study, one on the consumption of these types of products for human consumption, and then the use and consumption of veterinary products. And the third source of information was precisely to take a look at the consumption of drugs in the European continent, particularly in France. And once we had all of these sources of information, we selected different pharmaceutical products, different kinds of pharmaceuticals like antibiotic, antidepressants, and painkillers. And then we continued with the sample processing. This specific methodology was created in order to develop my thesis. And then we follow five main steps. First was the separation of the tissue from the shell. And once we did that, what we did was a process of freeze-drying and tissue milling, and then it was enriched with internal standards. And then we conducted an organic solvent extraction, and then we went through a purification and reconstitution process during these solid states with HLB, and then we reconstituted these by using methanol and water. And once we had the sample ready, we continued to the detection process with the liquid chromatography adapted to the equipment. It's a water equipment that it was used with. It's a highly sensitive. It is really important for this kind of methods because we need to escape distinguishing between similar molecules like the original that we have on the drugs and then the metabolites. So we were able to detect the presence of some molecules like carbamazepine, acetylphenone, caffeine, and levofloxacin on all the tissues of muscles and oysters. And in addition, we were able to detect that this really worked because we have recovery percentages exceeding 80%. As part of the conclusion, what we want to create the project is to raise awareness about the presence of these substances in coastal areas. And as a future proposal, we would like to continue to work with the research of these types of pollutants and organisms, and also to conduct analysis on these samples to try and see if we can detect other types of pollutants. Thank you very much, and I am here if you have any questions.
So much, Alejandra. When you can take a seat, continue. Let's take a few more people and keep on going with this part. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. También podemos hacer eso. ¿Vos sabes cuál es la contraseña del internet?
Sí, es océanos, la red,
Ah,
océanos, y la contraseña es océano 24.
con mayúscula.
La contraseña en minúscula, océano 24.
Presentation is loading. Much for the data project that I'm exposing today. Project trying to understand if changes are changing, climate changing. In the last operation, specifically a global reef monitoring network. As you can see, but you can see there that all the people that were collaborating, experts that were collecting information from fish on the region. Thank you so much. Changes over the species. This is NEC response to global warming. Is in distributions of the species. What the game habitats are no longer viable for those species. Displace themselves to the cold places. The information we have here is some of them are time information of abundance or biomass through time decades. We can understand the changes in abundance and hope that if climate changes are making changes in the population sizes, hope that abundance increment reflecting on population. And here, hotter or warmer extreme, see that abundance will go down. So see these changes in patterns of abundance. See where maybe start seeing even nor understand these changes patterns is significant will have an impact on the ecosystem. Does that translate to a level of Pacific, Oriental Pacific? So we have this particularity, and here it's traveling the equator. We have two limits that are colder. One that is closer to the equator, one that is closer to Mexico. All for the current. In the middle, Central America, we would find the limit would be closer to warmer, the warmest limit. So this is the range of temperature that species prefer. We're here, coldest place, and it starts to get hot. The once it starts if we're closer to the warmer, the middle, maybe warm abundance wouldn't change because we know that we prefer or tolerate warmer temperatures. All the more sensitive species, the abundance will go down. So this is what we would expect if the patterns of abundance change in response to climate change. Also, see the effect of really close, so that the way that they would displace themselves would be through larvae. So if climate velocity and currents go to the same place, and these changes will be taking place faster. So to understand the change, global change is going to change in the patterns of abundance of species, to need to know how our conditions changed in the last decades. How does the abundance, the biomass of free fish change distribution, and can change explain changes in abundance environment through the distribution of focusing in abundance more than in biomass, but we still have information of biomass. To choose the siting place, we wanted to have to select places that we're going to change three. So, but at the same time, we don't have that much information to balance both. Chose places that had more than 5 years of sampling, but that these 5 years represent 10 years of what they would done for that same time frame. And also that they would be settled, safe, protected section. Because we know that protection is important. It isn't perfect, but it would be helpful to control the variables. Be also having an effect. And I selected these 12 species. These are species that was able to was registered in 6 years or more, 10 or 11 of the sites, and that were also present higher density of 100.0 fish per square, so that we can understand changes through time. It's because we're present, we're registered, they're relatively abundant. Here, we're going to try to answer the first question: how the region changed in the last 2 decades, and then the effect analysis of the last one, the last week in the first graph, and the right information, direction, and the average sea surface. What is climate velocity? How many kilometers? How many kilometers do I have to I'm have to keep experiencing the same conditions in the next year? You can see that in most of the cases, it's about 10, well, it's close to 10 kilometers per year. In some places, where the magnitude of the velocity is higher. You can see we're going to Galapagos in red. They had some places where the velocity, the currents going in the same direction of the climate velocity. So like when the places are in red, like it's that we're gonna expect to see faster or higher rate changes. So we need to take into consideration the temperature the average sea temperature of the region itself. You can see that conditions are near of the limits of the cold limits of species. We would expect an increase in abundance as we are moving towards colder places. So I'm going to explain to you what we're seeing here. Here in these, I divided them in the places that were in the north and the ones that were in the south from 14 degrees north is expected north, the species will be displacing to south and south to south. That is, the climate velocity will displace towards north. And we can see that Espírito Santo y atrás, the climate is experience the same conditions. You should move in the south instead of north. So that's what we're seeing here. Here you can see the changes, geographic centuries of how do we calculate place, the geographic place have higher abundance of species 2020, 2012, and how it changed 2021. It's basically where are the species this, the geographic place we have a higher abundance of these species. In north, there are many species that go north that you would expect if climate would shift in abundance. There are some that aren't, and there are lots of reasons and ways to explain that. But I only have 5 minutes, so we're not going to get into that. And the south, also see that the geographic centuries are displacing to the south, like you'd expect to, uh, because of the change of magnitude and climate change and direction of the current. Also, we have these species that are displacing themselves in a contrarious way. So what's happening here is that based on temperature, there's another factor that is causing this, like oxygen, carbon productivity. Some species that are resilient to this has to do with ecological characteristics and biological characteristics that can be interesting to dig deeper into this to see which are the species that are more resilient and less resilient to climate change. This is the same, but in a map. So the message is that there are some species that displace yourself how you'd expect, basically the oceans, the ocean, the continental region, and from to the north in the north region. British Indonesia, one of the collaborators, told me that if you see a shift of continentalization of fauna in Galapagos, so this is what we're seeing on the field. And well, there are other species that aren't doing what we'd expect because first, many of the species have tolerance that are really high. Could be that maybe as it's getting warmer, the conditions are getting better for them. They can reproduce better. But this isn't as good as news because when this happens, reference presence is closer to the higher limit. So one Nino can make that conditions won't be viable for these species. I wanted to also understand change factors that change in distribution. And that characteristics that are associated to species like maximum length, maximum temperature preference. The bigger the changes are in abundance, the more there's a higher preference of temperature. Also, and you can also see that average temperature and climate velocity. Velocity, velocity, and current moving in the same direction. All of this has an influence on the patterns of abundance. As a conclusion, I must state that if we are seeing changes in patterns and abundance near of the golden limits of the magnitude of the climate velocity, the between currents in climate velocity and local temperature, we have significant effects to changing abundance and biomass. Many influencing the species, they are more resilient or not. They will be changing their abundance or not. Climate investigation is analysis of community. Try to understand this in a deeper way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll see if Roy Sarabia is here. Okay, there he is. So excellent, and thank you. We've already introduced you for you to know. Ah, sí. O sea, ¿será que alguien nos está viendo? Yo creo que si alguien nos está oyendo, es en lo que transmiten, porque aquí nadie está oyendo en inglés. Yo me fijé ahora y no hay nadie. O sea, se supone que para eso es esta vara, que hay alguien que nos está escuchando virtual. Pero aquí, digamos, en la sala, nadie está oyendo en inglés. Pero bueno. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today I want to talk to you about a project that we have been working on with the Pericos University at Piomola and Costa Rican Federation of Fisheries. And it was about the molecular identification of fish from Costa Rican markets. And this project arose because globally and also here in Costa Rica, we see incorrect labeling of species, which happens when a tissue or a muscle is labeled with a different name, which is not the right one. And then we've seen that globally, this is a problem that has been affecting marine species. And, that is something that happens due to two main reasons. And first is the idea is to hide a protected or regulated species, maybe an international or national agreement. And in this case, it could be that they're trying to hide species that cannot be traded in the country. So this can result in these types of agreements that ban the commercialization of these types of species, and this is why they have this a wrong label in order to be able to commercialize them, and also in order to sell species that have a lower value or low value species in order to be able to sell them at a higher price, which results in very important consequences, commercially speaking, for the people that eat this type of species. In Costa Rica, there is evidence of incorrect labeling in Costa Rica for sharks, in spite of the fact that there is a regulation for the labeling of species. For example, I don't know, I forgot the word. We have everything necessary in order to have labeling so that people will know what they're eating, where it comes from, and the scientific name and price. And we've seen in Costa Rica, and we've seen these products with the shark, and this is a study that conducted at San Jose Herediana, La Escuela, where we gathered mostly shark tissue, and we realized that many of the tissue was sold as bolillo or cazón, but these are really protected species like hammer sharks, hammer sharks, and others. And taking this into account, we came up with this question: is there incorrect labeling of other species in Costa Rica? So one of the species that we were wondering was billfish. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but these have a high economic value for the country in relation to sports fishing. And we have, for example, the different types of marlin, swordfish, sailfish. That's most important when it comes to billfish that are now being commercialized or traded. But with this in different background, globally, these types of fish being incorrectly labeled. And there is research, for example, in Mexico, where they realize that they are still in shark meat under the name of billfish. And also, I had the opportunity of working on this topic for my master's in Mexico, and we were able to find that they are selling tuna and other types of fish as billfish when they are not. And in this case, in order to be able to solve or mitigate this problem of labeling, we have the molecular analysis, and the idea is basically to obtain a tissue sample in the market, which is precisely what we did. We tried to obtain tissue from different fish in order to extract DNA and conduct a PCR following all the protocols that have been widely used and standardized, and now they are used in order to conduct all the types of research when it comes to labeling. And then we did the bar coding in order to be able to detect if there is incorrect labeling in our markets here in Costa Rica, in our case. And for for sample collection, we visited the main markets in the seven provinces of the country, where we were able to gather 196 samples under four different labels in the markets. You can find a sailfish, swordfish, white marlin, and also pink marlin. And later on, I will try and explain about this pink marlin, and to a lesser extent, it is sold as marlin. But we need to remember that marlin covers many different species of billfish. From the sample analysis, from a total of 196, 178 samples were successfully analyzed, out of which it's 33.71%, 60 of the samples have wrong labeling. But to go into details, from all the samples that have been labeled as a safe fish, we were able to see, once we analyzed the barcoding and everything, we saw that 93.44% of these samples, or 57 samples, were were identified as sailfish, so they were correctly identified. But we have four samples accounting for 6.56% that were wrongly labeled. They were labeled as sailfish, but these are things that come from other marlin species. For the samples that were labeled as a swordfish, we were able to see, once we conducted the barcode, that from all these samples, 96.43%, or the to 27 of these samples, they were labeled correctly as swordfish, and only one of them was wrongly labeled, and it was being sold as a swordfish, but it was a marlin. And from all these labels, they are the ones with less mistakes in markets. And on the other hand, we also have white marlin being sold in markets. And when we were conducting all these barcoding, we expected for these results of the labeling to give us the name, the scientific name that is associated with the white marlin, which is Cajiquia, and from the all the regulations, white marlin is a completely different species from all others that we have under the Cajiquia name. So as I mentioned, we expected for this tissue to be labeled as a white marlin to throw some results of Cajiquia albida, which is the one used for white marlin. But to our surprise, none of the tissues that were labeled as white marlin were indeed white marlin. So 86.36% were blue marlin. And yes, these are species that meet a similar distribution. And we have populations in the Pacific and the Atlantic. But these are completely different species at a given point. We thought that they were like a sister species, but after all the genetic analysis that we have conducted, it was determined that they are completely different. And also, we see that 11.36% is from Cajiquia audax, and 2.27% is for sailfish. So as I said, none of the samples that were analyzed as white marlin, or none of these tissues that we collected that had been labeled as white marlin were indeed white marlin. We have this particular case, which is pink marlin. If you go over all the regulations and take a look at the scientific name and the common name that are associated for billfish, then you'll be able to see, as part of this regulation, that marlin is not common for any of these. So it's quite confusing when we started this investigation to associate a scientific name to pink marlin. But in order to be clear, after all the barcoding in Costa Rica, the pink marlin is the one used for the striped marlin. And most of these samples, 71.79% of these samples, were striped marlin. And this is something to worry about, because is a name that is mistakenly used under the different agreements that protect the billfish in the country, and on the both on the agreements to protect them, and when they are classified only for sports fishing, and it's been classified under this wrong name. So I think it's important to update and analyze the common names that are currently being used in our country for these types of fishes, because they are generating information that could lead to confusion, and in the long run we won't be able to compare them with the information that could be generated within the region. And from all these samples, we were able to see that 20.51% were sailfish and 2.56 was for blue marlin. And we also had only 6 samples that were labeled as marlin, and it's not that it was incorrect, but we really need to know where these, which are the specific species. So out of these 6 samples, we we have that 5 of these samples were blue marlin, and 16.67% were for sailfish. So as you can see in the country, we do not have like a replacement of all these species, but what is really going on, or what we were able to see, is that there is not order in the application of scientific and common name, which is something that we see in the market, for example, with pink marlin, which can be which we also see as white marlin, and there are some agreements at national level regarding the names that are currently being used, including the scientific and common names. And this leads to confusion, because the scientific names that are no longer used, that are still being applied when they talk about striped marlin, is Tetrafurus, and there is an analysis that says that this species is not the Tetrapturus, and the same for blue marlin, because they are talking about the Macaira masara, which is a scientific name that is no longer used, because currently it's Macaira nigricans. So this is part of what we were able to discover after all this work, and we were able to see that there is no replacement for this species when it comes to marlin or sailfish, but there is a lack of order when it comes to the common and scientific names that are currently being applied to refer to these species, both on the agreements and in the markets where you can purchase this fish. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and the Biomon Lab, because this is where we were able to conduct the molecular analysis. And I would also like to thank the Costa Rican Fishing Association for the economic support and in the obtaining of the samples. And for you, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roy. We will continue with Maria Laura. And after Maria Laura, we're gonna have give a space for questions. Yo no la tengo.
La 4.
No.
Sí,
Mira.
bueno, es que yo no lo pude abrir. No está. Porque, ve, yo incluso le hice un download.
De aquí está vacío el
A
folder.
ver si acaso ya estaba vacío.
De ahí. Nos vamos así.
Ni modo. Sí, porque yo. This folder is empty. Sí, no, no está. Si yo le había hecho un download, nunca me apareció. Pero bueno. Eutroficación.
Well, good afternoon. For me, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I want to tell you a bit about the experience that we had from an initiative of restoring a reef, trying to respond to the extreme warmth that we experienced last year, and that it's still maintaining this year. I represent Raising Coral Costa Rica. We're an ONG that restore a reef. We've been working with them since 2016. Like, I'm gonna say this fast because we don't have much time. We cultivate reef, do it inside of the ocean, that continue with the transplant of reefs. We work in two places in Golfo Dulce and Cahuita, and so here's where all the concern comes from. As I was mentioned, and as many of you are familiarized with, last year we had an event of El Nino that it wasn't just El Nino, but previous from that we had heat waves that made it that it was a extreme warm. That was something that we know right now, like of the fourth an abnormal whitening, but warming of the ocean. This is the graphic that you can see is the difference in climate and weather changing. The orange one is from 2023. That is much warmer from anything we have recorded since 1981. And the black one that is most underlined is 2024. That unfortunately is even higher from the one that we saw in 2023. So here lies a challenge as an initiative of restoration. And how do we respond to this threat in such a big scale? How do we protect reef? How do we protect initiatives? And here's where a contingency plan takes place. And it's what when I explain today. There's something that is happening today. But basically, what we're trying to do is by using artificial structures, using the profundity, like as a species of defense to radiation, and we try to disperse the risk of losing all the genetic material that we have in the reef by utilizing many places. This we did it in Golfo Dulce and also in the south of the Caribbean in the National Park Cahuita and Manzanillo. So when I'm talking to you about these artificial structures, talking about the research, it consists in a hexagonal metallic structure that is filled with minerals that are used for the the assisted restoration that may be from 5 to 100 structures that help stabilize and use as substrate to the cultivation of reef. In this case, we use it specifically to looking for deepness. We've done this for many years, and we do it as a contingency plan this time. So specifically in Golfo Dulce, we were working in 5 areas. Point one that is called Plantanares, and point two Punta Gallardo, Sándalo, and Punta Estrella. To have information on the internal, the medium, and the external part of the Gulf. So we were working with Porcilopora, Verrucosa, and Grandis. And in the case of Golfo Dulce, we've been working since 2016. So we've cultivated thousands of reef that come from 16 colonies that we know that now represent 14 types of genotype. So in all of these places, we put from 8 to 14 fragments of these genotypes to monitor the response in each size in the moment of the whitening. In the case of the Caribbean, it's a bit different because it's a newer project. So what we did, also we were only working in Cahuita, we expanded to Gandoca and Manzanillo, trying to protect a bit more. In this case, to the species that is Acropora palmata, that is in a critic, endangered position. We established these clusters and we took fragments from donors of nearby colonies. In the case of Gandoca, we took from Punta Uva. We took samples and we took it to a cluster that was in a deeper part in the area. We used 6 colonies per site. That is more or less the colonies that we can find right now. In general, we monitored monthly the survival and the health of each of the fragments in the structures. We used photo quadrants for the covering of coral reef. Through that time, we used Hobo Pro V2 temperature monitors And also we evaluated from the ecological visuals the associated reef from July. This is from July to April from this year. Now, as I was saying, the results. I have the results in the preliminary discussion. In the case of the Caribbean, this part is the Sylvester part. The colonies of Acropora palmata that live in the reef. What we saw is that 56% of mortality. So we lost 56% of Acropora. And from the ones that remained, 18% presented a partial mortality. Adding to this, to the other coral, we had a mortality of 0 to 10% mortality and 2 to 8% mortality, or partial mortality. And in the experiment we were doing, the Acropora, the reef star, had a mortality of 46% to 100%, and in the Acropora palmata was a 50% mortality. And specifically here, well, the circles moved in the presentation, but specifically in the Caribbean, what we did identifies that the sedimentation is a subject that is really worrying. It is not a surprise since in the 80s, Mr. Jorge Cortez reported this. This is reflected in our results. In the case of Perezoso and Puerto Vargas, survival was of 0%. In the case of Cabo, it was of 45% because it's closer to the reef barrier. So the area dynamics of the place is completely different. We have much more current. And in the case of Punta Uba and Manzanillo, Manzanillo had a survival rate of 46%, and Punta Uba had a survival of 0%, which is a bit different because both of them have a different hydrodynamics, but we believe that something that could be affecting is the genetic side of it and the subject theme. So we also find some things like temperature, average temperature in the surface was 31.3 degrees Celsius. The maximum temperature that was reported in the structures is 31.2 degrees Celsius, which means is that stratification of temperature is really low. It's almost the same being at 7 meters than being at 0 meters. So we believe that that affected a lot because in the end what happened is that they had the stress of temperature plus the stress of sediment. And in the Caribbean, that period of stress was between September and October. And in spite of everything, the lowest temperature region in average was Manzanillo. That could be also a reflection on what we saw. And also, I mentioned before that there could be a genetic factor between Manzanillo and Punta Uba, and it's just because the fragments that went from Manzanillo came from a reef that is called Sugar Reef. During the monitoring of these reefs, it was the only patch that the Acropora colonies did not whiten. So if the rest of the Caribbean was whitened, this didn't. So these were the fragments that survived. So we can see a tendency that should be analyzed. Possible things that we saw was that when we were doing the fragmentation, we found out that there were some colonies that were getting ready for the egging. Could could affect the survival rate. It has sedimentation regimen that is really high, and then in the Kawita side of it has a lot of organic content, which makes it more inclined to damage reef. And another subject that is really important is that once they're whitened, it's hard for them to clean themselves from sediment with their tentacles. So again, to exposing them to those sedimentations, maybe it was more stressful. And the Pacific side is a bit more promising. Again, in the wild part, it was really dramatic. We had a mortality of 95% of colonies, and from the the ones remaining, 3.8% presented partial mortality. From the massive corals, had 45% of mortality, and the ones that didn't die had partial mortality of 55%. So, I'm sorry, there was a mistake here in the presentation. The survival of Posilopo was of 33.6%. Sorry, the mortality was 33.6%. It was better than in the wild part, and in the reef start, it was a 50% to 100% mortality. Just one place had 0% of survival, that it was Platanares. Well, maybe that's probably because it was the least deep place, and the dynamic that is doesn't just it doesn't let reef to create by itself. You can see that in in Punta Gallardo we had much more survival with a 50.3%, and it also permitted surviving genotype of 13. Interesting things in the Pacific. In the average temperature, we had 33 degrees Celsius. In the maximum temperature, deep, it was 32 Celsius. The stratification was 1 Celsius. There was a different. The period of stress in the Pacific was July to October, which was really, really long. And Gallardo was the place that had the daily average in the lowest point. We did not find a difference between Posilopora. We worked two species, they survived similarly. We found an effect of the genetic donors that was really high. From those genotypes that I was talking about, we found the genotypes that were really resilient, like D2, D23, D25, and D30. Some are really resistant, and some just recently. There could be a evidence of the plasticity that corals have once they naturally are put through stress periods. And here we had other genotypes that did not make it. Now in the Pacific side, during the El Nino in 2016, since then we didn't have something as catastrophic as this. In this moment, we did not have restoration plans, but right now we have. Apart from this, we noticed a similar pattern in Punta Gallardo, which makes us wonder about these ecological characteristics. Something to rescue is the role that plasticity can have in the resistance in reef, and that they discovered recently that Basilopoda in the Pacific has been changing. So this symbiote that lives there is being Durus dinum glini, that is one of the species that help with worm. Now the conclusions, general conclusions, preliminary from what we have is that definitely to work again in restoration, especially in the Caribbean part, we need to understand what's going in the sedimental part. That the genetic information is fundamental, and this implies that even if we don't have the money to make these analyses of a genotype, we still need to follow the guidelines to permit having biodiversity. And it's also to understand which genotypes are different, understanding the ways of adaptation and way to manage the efforts of restoration. And now that's something that we take is that proactivity is a measure in these types of extreme climate events and in a place as vulnerable as reef is fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Laura. And we're going to now open a space for questions and answers. We are going to have a few minutes. And please remember that you need to use the microphone for questions. So, are there any questions for the speakers? For Maria Laura, what are the parameters that you use in all these places where you work with the reefs? How do you design where to use these or apply the systems? Okay. What we've done is to choose reefs that are already in a process of restoration, so that you know what what has been going on, and our nurseries are far away from where we do the transplants. So for this type of structures that are more experimental, then we have applied them in places where we already have the ribs, but more in depth, and also in other places. And with all the changes that we see when it comes to temperature and currents, maybe in the future it could be a good place for corals, but once we have more experience, so you can adapt, yeah, and then you start changing. Do we have any other questions? Thank you for the presentations. I think they were incredibly interesting. And for Maria Laura, I want to know, well, one of your conclusions was that you needed to do more research on sedimentation, right? And this can be associated to hypoxia. And maybe in Golfo Dulce, with all the, what have you thought about the effect of oxygen for restoration purposes? I think that this is something recent. We prepare for this event because both Cahuita and Golfo Dulce are vulnerable to this hypoxia effect. And with the CMARC, we started doing some monitoring for the water quality and some other parameters that we are trying to apply, like oxygenation, and to see how much we can contribute to this data in order to relate it to what we are working on. But for now, as an NGO, what we're doing is to try and work with what we have now, but we need to create more alliances. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you. I have a question for Alejandra regarding. My question is, how many pharmaceutical products did you try to map when you conducted this study? And out of those mapped, how much were you able to identify? And the other question is for the reef fish. Why specifically reef fish if we know that they have such a high tolerance to changes in temperature? Thank you for the question. We started with 17 molecules in order to analyze the tissue, and for now we are still processing data given the material that we have been able to collect, but we are currently working with the molecules like acetaminophen and many others, but we started with 17 molecules. Why reef fish? Well, the fact that they have this high resistance to temperature This is not as beneficial because the truth is that what we've seen with many of these reef fish is that the thermal preference is high, and that's when they reach their reproduction and growth highest rates, but they are close to the upper thermal tolerance level. So, for example, if we have events like El Nino and we have a one more degree in the temperature, so they will fish go from being happy and at ease to not being able to survive in those types of waters, partially because many of these species are from the tropics, where in general the environment is well, there are not as many abrupt changes in temperature, but as a result of climate change, we see now a higher frequency and duration of this type of extreme events that might impact reef fish. And the other, as for the other thing, is just because out of practical reasons, because we have incredible databases that can teach us a lot about how fish can change throughout their distribution for the past decades, and I think that this is quite valuable. And if it's not the only group of species, it's one of those for which we have this type of information. My apologies, we cannot translate without a microphone. If we're going to be working with these types of indicators, then we'll need to see what you want to apply them to or what you're more interested. But I think, yes, it would be interesting to work with the bigger species, the smaller species, and with the one that are more that can adapt to colder or warmer waters, and also the specializations when it comes to ecology as one of the general aspects. And I think that more specialized species tend up to be more vulnerable. So yes, we can choose this as an indicator, but we take into consideration many of these characteristics. We'll continue with three more presentations. Now I'll give the floor to Alison Centeno. I don't know if she's here with us. You have 15 minutes, and then after these three presentations, we'll continue with the Q&A. Thank you and good afternoon. I am going to talk to you about an analysis of the landings of long life fishing in Costa Rica and the Pacific in Costa Rica from 2015 to 2021. First of all, as an introduction, longline fishing in Costa Rica is defined as selective fishing gear that uses a mother line on which hooks with properly embedded hooks are placed to catch pelagic and demersal species. We have a surface or more in-depth fishing depending on the type of fish that we are interested in. And here we have a graphic representation of long line fishing at, and the types of fishes. It's crucial social and economic importance for coastal livelihoods and processing and export industries. And it's also important because it's really important for these types of markets, in addition to being the type of fishing that export these products to international markets, mainly the United States, and also this type of fishing. In 2018, they started with a project in order to make improvements, but currently this is inactive. And the idea was to improve, to make this type of fishing more selective. And according to this procedure, we could also opt for better market opportunities. And The fifth is the targeted fishery for three primary species, which are mahi-mahi, tuna, and swordfish. But there are also other secondary species which are not well defined and they have not reference points, in which we have sharks and billfish.
Ahí esto se corrió un montón. Pero bueno, básicamente
Basically,
en Costa Rica, en el Pacífico,
in
tenemos
Costa Rica and the Pacific,
embarcaciones
we
de
have
caza.
311 vessels in the
Los
Pacific, out of which
interesantes
62%
son de mediana escala
are medium
y el
scale
resto
and
de avanzada
the
escala. Estas
others are
definiciones
advanced scale. And these
realmente pues varían de
definitions
Infopesca
were
dependiendo de
done
lo
by
que pida la
InfoPespa,
embarcación.
depending on
De
the
autonomía en
autonomy of
cuánto
the
ellos
vessels,
pueden
meaning
salir, cuántos
how
náuticas pueden
many
salir para pescar. Y en este
nautical
caso, la
miles
mediana
they
escala era
can
la que podía
move.
salir un
And so
poco
medium
más
scale
poco en comparación
was,
a la
of
avanzada.
course, less than the
Y
advanced
bueno,
scale.
el 55%
And
de las embarcaciones
55% of
están
long-line
en
vessels
Punta Arenas.
have Punta Arenas as their home port.
Um, ok, algunas de las
Some of
implicaciones
the
de la
implications
pesquisa.
of long-line
em,
fishing.
Está la captura de
We have the
especies
capture of
que tienen una
species of
interconexión con otras
interest
actividades
to
económicas
other
importantes en el país,
important
como la
economic
pesca
activities
deportiva
in the
o el
country,
turismo.
like sport fishing or tourism.
Amenaza también
It also
poblacionales de
threatens
grandes
populations of
predadores,
large predators,
interacciona con
such as sharks and billfish,
tiburones y marlines, que son
marlins,
los depredadores tope. Entonces,
which are the
digamos que
larger predators. So,
ocurre sobrepesca,
if
se hacen,
they are highly vulnerable
no
to
sé, afectan a la
overfishing.
vulnerabilidad de los
So
ecosistemas
this contributes to
y
the
el problema
vulnerability of
también a la
ecosystems
sobreexplotación y
and also
desequilibrio de los
overexploitation
ecosistemas.
and imbalance of marine
Y todas
ecosystems.
estas
And
acciones,
last,
todas estas
all
características de
these
multiplicaciones nos
characteristics
deportan y aportan a los
have
riesgos de
economic and
integridad,
food
de
security
integridad
impacts
alimentaria de las
on
embarcaciones que
coastal
están
communities,
principalmente beneficiadas
mainly
por
those
turismo.
that benefit from these type of activities.
Ok, y bueno, una de las problemáticas que
One of
tenemos
the
en
problems
el
that
país
we have in the country
es que existen pocos
is
estudios
that we do
realizados
not
o
have many
investigaciones
studies that have been
mostrando
conducted because we
el
don't have
impacto
much digitalized data
o incluso
or
fiables para estudiar
even
la
reliable
pesquisa.
data in order to study
Y
this
normalmente
topic,
carecen de
and
información
they
sobre los
lack
sistemas para el análisis
information
de náuticas, por
to
ejemplo,
conduct more
identificar el
specific
captura,
analysis like the
el
exact
cambio de
location of
tamaño de
catches,
especies, los movimientos
the
entre
sizes
especies
and
durante el
weights
turismo.
of individuals.
Entonces,
Because we do not have all this
todo esto
information,
hace
so
que
all of
a la hora
these
de hacer evaluaciones de
results that
capturas
when we are doing
tomar
these
en
evaluations,
cuenta suposiciones
we need to make
y
too many
no se pueden
assumptions,
hacer análisis
and we
mucho
cannot
más
conduct more
completos.
complex
Este no
or
es un problema que solo se
comprehensive
limita
analysis, and this is not a
a
problem that applies
países
only to Costa Rica, but I think that
en
it
países
applies to
y
America in general and
sin
other
embargo,
countries.
a pesar de que no
However,
tenemos
in
datos
spite of the fact
suficientes
that we do not
o
have a
históricos,
complex data or
sabemos
historic
de cómo
data,
están las
maybe
posiciones
we can
de las
get
embarcaciones.
an idea about this type of fishing.
Entonces, la idea de este
So,
análisis
the
es
objective of this
traer
analysis
análisis,
is
base de análisis
to analyze the
científico
characteristics of
procedentes de parques de
pelagic
capturas
fish
peligrosas
landings
procedentes por medio
by
del
the commercial
Pacífico
long-line fleet
y tratar
operating in Costa
de
Rican Pacific,
entender
and
cómo
to
ha
try to
cambiado
understand
la
how
pesca durante el periodo
this type of
2015-2021
fishing changed during
y
the
a
period
partir de estas
2015 to
observaciones,
2021, and
recomendaciones
through non-traditional statistical
sobre cómo se
analysis
puede
in order to be able to
analizar
make
el fenómeno.
recommendations.
Aquí el área de estudio
This is the area of
básicamente como
study.
les decía anteriormente
Basically,
no
as I
tenemos
said before,
análisis exactos
we do not
de la
have
captura,
specific
pero
locations for
básicamente se
these
seguimos de
captures.
2007.
And
Entonces se tomó como
we
referencia
took as
capturas
a
de zona
reference
exclusiva, donde
some of
tuvimos
these
la mayoría
areas
de flota palangreras.
where the most
Y bueno,
of
es una área
these
biológica muy
fish
productiva
comes, and this is a
donde a
very
lo largo de los
productive
años ha
area
sido
where
utilizada
throughout the
no
years
solo por la
this
flota
has been
mercantil,
used
sino
not
también
only
por
for Costa
flotas
Rica
extranjeras de
but
pesca
also
y la
other
flota comercial.
foreign fish for
Y ahí
commercial
podemos ver
fishing.
también los
And
puertos de
here
desembarque
we can
más
take a look
importantes
at
en
the
el
most
país:
important
Punta
ports
Arenas,
in the
Golfito,
Pacific, like Punta
Quepos,
Arenas,
Playas del
Golfito,
Coco
Quepos, Playas del
y
Coco, and Cojiniquil.
bueno, un poco de los datos. En este
As
caso,
a
pues
data source,
utilicé
these are the
son
data
datos de
that I use.
desembarques de
that come from landing data were obtained from the Costa Rican Institute of Fisheries and Aquaculture in Copesca, and that this was taken by the inspectors because they are in charge of collecting data and identifying the different species and to try and weigh them. And then we conducted an standardization and debugging of databases for years because sometimes we found some errors. And then we added some characteristics for this database. For example, the registration number, the license type,
la talla, ¿no? Ese tipo de errores.
is
Y la
not size.
especificación
This is an
del
error. And also
estado
the
de
scientific
conservación
name and
de la
conservation status were
especie.
also included.
Bueno, un poco de los análisis que se
As,
realizaron, no son
as
todos
for data analysis, this is
como
not a
una
comprehensive list,
introducción
but this is
que se hizo
more
realmente
like an
exploratorio
introduction. We conducted exploratory, descriptive, and comparative analysis
los desembarques durante el
of pelagic
periodo,
fish landings during the
periodo de
period.
tiempo para ver
And
cómo
also we used the
habían,
time series analyzed
cuáles eran como las
in
tendencias
order
de los
to
desembarques a lo
detect the
largo del
trends
periodo
for all these
y
landings throughout the
para
period,
detectar si había
in
diferencias
order
entre
to
los tipos de
detect
flota
what were the
de
differences
desembarque
between fleet type,
y
port of disembarkation,
los puertos de desembarque y se
and
realizaron análisis
we also
periódicos de varianza.
conducted multivariate
Pues
permuted analysis of
básicamente los
variance.
precios
And
y
we
demás
also
han
analyze
sido convenios a las
if
variaciones
they
en
were
cualquier
similar
medida
to the variations in the
que
event
no
that
califique
we
como
detected
exóticas
them
y
to
similares.
identify the species that mostly have an
Ok, así
affect the
que
variation of
los
these
resultados, bueno,
landings.
esto es
These are some
como
of
la
the
conclusión
results,
porcentual de los
and this is
desembarques
like the
durante el
conclusion in
periodo de
percentages
junio
of the landings
y
throughout this
acá se puede
period.
observar
And in here,
que los
we
tiburones son
can
los que
see that
predominan,
sharks
así como
are the
le
ones
siguen
that are
el
predominant,
dorado
and followed by mahi
y
mahi.
una de las cosas
And
interesantes de acá
something
es
interesting
que
here
las especies
is,
predominantes,
is
casi
that from the most
el 50%, más del
the species that
50%
account
de los
for over
desembarques son especies
50% of the
secundarias,
main landings are
están los
secondary
animales que se llaman
species.
picudos, que no
For
son
example,
especies primarias
billfish,
según
which are not primary,
de mejoramiento de las
in
especies.
order to analyze
Y
this
las
for the
especies a las
improvement
que
of
ustedes
the
siguen
fishing. And also,
no representan ni el 50%.
they do not account for
Em,
50% of
bueno,
landings to species that are not the main target of the long line
sí, la
fleet.
especie que más
And
predominó en
the
los desembarques que
species
hubo
that
fue el
have more
Traduccion, que acá
was
ya está en cuatro,
sharks,
y sí, eso sería.
and that would be it.
Y aquí les voy a enseñar un poco como las... Ay, es que está mal, perdón.
My apologies,
Esto
there
no
is
debería estar
an
acá.
error
Perdón.
here,
La idea es, creo
but
que el
the
primer...
idea,
Bueno, si quieres lo pones acá. El primer gráfico es el de
the
atún.
first chart
Entonces,
is for
básicamente, la
tuna.
captura de
So
presión
basically, there
ha
was an
decrecido según
increase
otras
in
fuentes
capture, according to
glaciares y
some
terrestres
sources,
a lo largo de los años
throughout
y
these
alcanzó niveles
years,
bastante bajos en el
and it
2017 al
reached the
2018.
lowest levels in
En este momento,
2017 and 18.
la
And
figura A,
currently, in figure
ahí se
A,
puede ver cómo
you can
en el
see
2017 y
how in
2018
2017 and
también se
2018
reportaron
there
niveles
was a
demasiado
decrease
bajos.
in catches
Eh,
reaching low levels.
y bueno, en el
And
2020
in
se
2020,
ve que se reportan los desembarques más altos para ambas
relatively
flotas.
high monthly
Y esto
averages was
podría estar
observed in both
relacionado,
fleets, which could
según
be
lo que
related,
dicen algunos expertos,
as
puede estar relacionado a
according to
las
the experts,
regulaciones
to the
durante el COVID-19,
regulations that were applied
reduciendo
during
la actividad
COVID-19,
pesquera a nivel
resulting
global
in a
y la
reduction of
tendencia
fishing
a ciertas
activities,
distancias.
and
Y
also due
también
to
la
the presence
Comisión
of foreign
Interamericana de
fleets,
las
and also the
Tropicales
Inter-American
llevó
Tropical Tuna
varias
Commission
hipótesis
evaluated several
que
hypotheses,
podría estar relacionado con
and I think that
una
this could be
mezcla espacial
related
de
to
las
a
especies
possible
en zonas
spatial mixing of stocks in the
La
Eastern
especie
Pacific.
predominante de atún
And these are
es el
some,
atún aleta amarilla.
and the predominant species is the yellowfin tuna.
Bueno, entonces en picudos les voy a
As
hablar
for
apenas de tres
billfish,
especies
I'm
que
going
son
to
como
talk
las
about
más
only three species,
importantes
which are the most important
para los
ones, at
análisis.
least for this
Bueno, el
analysis.
atún
Blue
¿verdad? Es
marlin,
simplemente un stock en todo el Pacífico, entonces las
uh,
evaluaciones se
that's
realizan
something that
para
we
este
see
solo
in the
stock
Pacific, and
y
these
según
were
estudios
all
glaciares dicen que hay una tendencia de
studies. And
disminución
there's a trend of decline in
y
catches,
como las imágenes
coinciding with
están
what
mal,
was
no les
reported.
puedo enseñar
And I cannot show
pero
you here because
en los
there's a
gráficos sí se
mistake in the
observa
charts,
bastante
but
bien que
it
que había una tendencia
there was
respecto al pez de
this
escala,
trend. As for
la
sailfish,
flota de mediana escala
the
fue
medium
la que
scale
reportó
fleet
una alerta
recorded
mayor
a
de
higher
desastre y
landing than the advanced
es
fleet,
interesante
which
porque
is
tiene
interesting
diferente
because
a
it's
la
different
composición de
to the
desembarques o
composition
las
of
tonalidades
the
de desembarque que se
landings
pueden observar en las
that
otras
you
especies,
can see
porque
for
todas las
other
otras especies
species,
la flota avanzada
particularly
era septentrional.
for
Y esto puede estar
others,
relacionado
and
porque
this
son
could
unas
be
especies
related
que se encuentran mucho más costera por sus
to
características
this being
biológicas y
more common in
se
coastal
tienen
areas because of all
datos
the
reportados
features, and
por
according to the
Lancia
data
y CISOS
reported by the UCC
durante el 2015 y
CIAT
2021, también
between
las capturas
2016 and
disminuyeron
2021 decreased
bastante y se aproximaban a ese nivel.
significantly compared to previous years.
Y luego respecto a
And
los
then,
desembarques de pez
as
espada,
for the landings of
según
swordfish,
las evaluaciones estadounidenses,
according
también
to
ha
the
habido una
evaluations,
disminución de
there is
población.
also a declining trend in recent years.
Y acá,
In here,
tiburón
we have
y
shark
dorado tiburón, y
and
aquí estoy
mahi
presentando
mahi
todos los gráficos.
as part of this chart.
Bueno, el dorado en Costa Rica tenemos
Dorado
una
capture
concentración
in
bastante
Costa Rica
avanzada.
is
La temporada de dorado va
mainly
de
concentrated in the
noviembre
months
a
of
febrero.
November to February.
Y acá hay
And
una relación
in here, we see an
interesante según
interesting
la
relation
interpretación.
according
Las
to the
escalas están
correlation
muy, muy
analysis,
correlacionadas las
because
flotas. Cuando la flota avanzada se dirige a dorado, la flota
when the advanced
intermedia se dirige a
fleet
dorado. Y
is aiming
esto no
for mahi
pasa
mahi,
o pasa de
but this
forma
is
muy, muy
not the
leve
case
en los
or
desembarques de
for
tiburón.
the landings
Y
of
esto podría
shark.
estar
And this
relacionado
could
a
be
que
related
durante la temporada
to
de
the
dorado
fact that
las
during the
flotas
mahi
están muy
mahi
bien protegidas las
season,
especies, pero
this
el
is
resto del
what they
año
concentrate on,
no.
but for
Y esto
not for the
produce
rest of the year. So
cambiar
this is what
niveles de
we
especie,
do.
incluso
They
niveles de pez,
change,
y esto
and
mejora o
this is
dirige
going
la
to
pesca
improve
a
or
tiburón.
aim these efforts
Entonces,
to the
esto
fishing of
comprueba de
sharks, and
que
this
está habiendo una dirección,
demonstrates
una pesca dirigida
that
hacia
this is a
tiburones
directed fishing
específicamente.
for sharks.
Y bueno, como ya todos sabemos,
And as
los
we all
tiburones
know,
han estado en decrecimiento a lo largo
there's
de
a
los años
decrease in shark
y
catches over
también
the
coincide con el
years,
periodo de estudio.
coinciding with the
Y
study
bueno,
period.
según la correlación,
And as for
eh,
the correlation,
son los que más aportan a la
they are the
variación
ones that
evolutiva.
contribute the most to these variations.
Aquí en el análisis permutado de la varianza, básicamente
This
lo
is
que
an
podemos ver
analysis in which we
pues son el
see
año, el
mostly
mes, el
the
puerto,
month, year,
estaba
the port,
relacionado con las
and
variaciones
this was related
en la
to
descripción de desembarque
variations in the
y
composition,
efectivamente
and
todos dieron diferencias entre
they
realmente
all
significativas
through
en donde
significant
quedan un
differences.
1%. Y
As we
posteriormente
can
se
see
realizó
here, and
pruebas simples.
subsequently we
Aquí no les
conducted
voy a
some
mostrar todos los
tests. I'm not going
resultados,
to show
pero
you
uno
all
de los
the
resultados
results, but
importantes
one of the most
que
important
también
results
responde a los
that
resultados anteriores
responds
es que
to
los
prior results
tiburones
is that
influyeron
sharks
muchísimo en las
had an
diferencias
influence on the differences
entre tipos de flota.
in the types of fleets.
Que algunas de las
These are some of
conclusiones,
the
la
conclusions.
pesquería de palangre requiere
Lone fishery
enfoques
requires
mucho más
multivariate
profundos y
research
debido a
approaches
su
due to its
características multiespecíficas
multi-specific,
y
multiple
también a
specificities,
su
and then
idea de arte de pesca
the type
selectivo,
of fleet, which is
el tipo de flota, su
its
autonomía, los
range, the
puertos, el
port,
tiempo en el
the
que
landing
desembarcan
time are
estos
important
que
factors
están influyendo en la variación de
in
las
the
especies
variation of
capturadas
species
y
caught.
probablemente muchos otros
And
factores
probably many
no están
other
tomando en cuenta
factors are
ahorita
being taken
porque no tienen
into
acceso a esos datos
account, but we
tan
do not have
importantes
access
para
to all the data
entender
that we
la
needed,
dinámica de
which
las
are necessary
pesquerías.
to understand the
Los
dynamics of
tiburones
this type of
influyen
fish and sharks
en
influence
las
differences
diferencias entre flotas
between fleets.
y acá se podría
And
empezar
in
a
here,
hacer esfuerzos
we
a
could
propósito de
start
estos tipos de manejo
making efforts to see how
porque
we
ya se
can
están
better handle them,
diferenciando o
because now
caracterizando
we're
las
seeing
especies que están
characteristics of
influyendo
species
más.
that
Y bueno,
are
obviamente hay muchos
that have
vacíos de
a higher
información, muchas
influence, and of course
deficiencias.
there are information gaps and
Entonces
deficiencies
se propone o
in
la ciencia
controls.
entró en
So
roles
we
como
propose to have a
implementación de
better
métodos
control
de
system and
vigilancia
implementation of fishery
para conocer
management
los
measures
impactos
in order
como
to
los
get to
del
know
cáncer.
other things.
Y bueno,
And
obviamente es
it is
importante involucrar
obviously
a todas las
important to
partes
involve
interesadas
all the
porque el estudio de
stakeholders,
las pesquerías no solo
because
es un insumo para la
this is
comunidad
not an
científica,
input
sino
only for
también
the
para las
scientific
instituciones
community,
que
but
están
also
buscando
for the
mejorar su
people that
evaluación
are involved
para poder utilizar
in
estos
fishing
sistemas.
in order
Y
to
algunos de
reduce
los puntos de
costs.
mejora,
And
obviamente es
these are
importante
some of the
estudiar esas
areas
sequías
for
para
improvement. It is
poder
crucial to
hacer
deepen the study of the
mejores
longline
estrategias
fishery for
de
its improvement and
mitigar
for the development
y
of
hacer
these
diferentes
strategies,
estrategias de conservación.
conservation strategies.
Em, o la falta de
There's
información
also a lack of
independiente
fishery independent
va a
information
dificultar
that is going to hinder
entender
how we
de una
can
forma más integrada y
understand in a
más
more
compleja las
comprehensive and
fisherías,
complex
sobre
manner
todo
a
porque como es
fishery,
multiespecífica,
because since it
es mucho
has
más compleja.
multiple specifications,
Eh,
it is more complex
Según
too.
la CIAD y
And
muchas
according
otras
to SIAD and
organizaciones, la
many other
implementación de sistemas
organizations, the
de
implementation of
monitoreo
electronic monitoring
electrónico sería
systems
importante, además de
would
que
be
permitiría
important
también
because it would
que
also
haya
allow
un mejor
for
acceso y una
a better
mejor
access and
trazabilidad y que
traceability
puedan acceder
in
las
fishery
personas a la
products
pesquería a
for
mercados
the
de mucho
people to have
más
access to markets
rentables y
that
que
are
busquen la
more
sostenibilidad y
profitable
mucho
with
mejor
better
mejorar sus
returns
calidades
and
de
in
vida.
order to improve their quality of life
Y
and
la
livelihoods.
capacitación de los pescadores
And
en
training
estos
fishers in
métodos
selective
que mejoren
and
esta
efficient
productividad.
methods
Por
could
ejemplo,
improve the
las metodologías
profitability. For
científicas
example, the
pueden
different
servir para
methodologies that could be
mejorar
applied
la disponibilidad
to
de
improve the
pesca.
sustainability.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you
Mis
very much.
disculpas por
And my apologies for the errors.
pueden escribir si
And
quieren.
this is my mail if you want.
Thank you. We're going to continue with Felipe Tomas Alvarez
Y Chantal Rodríguez.
and Chantal
Que no te has
Rodriguez.
presentado, voy a aprovechar.
Chantal, we didn't present you.
Chantal Rodríguez
Chantal
Esquivel.
Rodriguez Esquivel.
Ella es bióloga marina de la
She's a
Universidad
biologist and a
Nacional.
marine biologist from the
Experiencia en la
university,
conservación y restauración
National University.
coralina. Actualmente trabaja en el
She
área de
actually works in
investigación
investigation area in
Oceana,
Oceana, Costa
Costa Rica. A
Rica.
Felipe Tomás ya lo habíamos
Felipe
presentado.
Thomas we already introduced.
Bueno,
Well,
buenas tardes.
good
Muchas
afternoon.
gracias por
Thank
su
you
presencia acá.
for your presence here.
Esta presentación
This
se
presentation
enmarca en un concepto
is
distinto
framed in
al
a
que hemos
different
estado viendo hoy
concept
día,
from what we've seen here.
que todas eran de un ámbito un poco
That
más
all of them were from a
científico.
scientific
Nosotros venimos
place
a
or
contar la
aspect.
experiencia de
We are
trabajo
going
que
to
tiene
tell you about the experience that
nuestro Centro de Conservación
our
Oceana
Center of
en el área de conservación acosa,
Conservation,
en el
Oceanic
Pacífico Sur de
Conservation
Costa Rica.
has in the Pacific,
Eh,
tropical Pacific of
Voy a
Costa
ponerme
Rica.
por acá,
I'm gonna place
un
myself here
poquito, para visualizarlos
so
a
that I
todos y
can
también poder ver
see all
la,
of you and so
la
that you
presentación.
can all see the presentation.
En ese sentido, la misión de
In this
Oceana
sense, the
es
mission of
trabajar
Oceana is
por la
to
protección efectiva de los
protect
ecosistemas que son de
efficiently
importancia para la
the
humanidad.
critical
En Oceana
zones in the ocean
parte
for the future of humanity
trabajando
and
el año
ecosystems
2017
of the
en
planet.
España, se funda en España,
It was
pero
founded in
luego ya en
Spain, but
2018
in
llega acá a Costa
2018
Rica
it came to
y ya
Costa
en
Rica.
2021
In 2021,
contamos con un centro de
we have
conservación
a
que está en
center of
Cochán
conservation
y que nos permite
that lets
trabajar
us
en esta
work
vía
in
de
this
implementar la
life of
conservación
implementing
más efectivamente.
conservation effectively.
Esa es un poco nuestra misión.
This
Y
is
para
our
eso la
mission.
siguiente, por favor. Para eso
For
contamos con
this,
un equipo
we have
grande de
a
al
team
menos
of
12
maybe
personas
12 people
donde
where
trabajamos
we
biólogos,
work biologists,
ingenieros,
engineers,
diseñadores gráficos, instructores de
graphic
buceo,
designers,
también
scuba diver instructors,
administradores, gente de
managers,
mantenimiento y
maintenance
capitanes
people,
también de
and
nuestra embarcación.
also
¿Por
captains
qué les
from
cuento esto? Porque en el fondo
vessels.
nuestra
Why
base
do I
de trabajo
tell you this?
tiene
Because
que ver
in
con
the
esa
end,
colaboración
our
tanto
workforce
interna del
is
equipo, donde
built
se
with
entrelazan
all
todas
this
estas
interconnection
formas,
of
estas profesiones,
professionals
estas
and
distintas
professions,
formas de
distinct
ver la
ways
vida,
of
distintos
viewing
distintos
life.
approach que
There are all
tenemos
the different
para los
approaches that we
trabajos,
have for
pero también eso
different
se
works.
ve hacia afuera.
We also
Tratamos
see
de
this
transmitir
to
hacia
the
las alianzas
outside,
que
try to
estamos
transmit
conformando
to
con
alliances that we try to
universidades,
make
otros
with
centros de
universities,
investigación
other
y
centers
también
of
con el estado
investigation,
de Costa
and
Rica.
with the state of Costa
Así
Rica.
es. Básicamente,
Basically,
el programa
the program
de Inoceana
of
en
Inoceana
ACOSA,
in ACOSA,
en el área de conservación de
in
OSA,
the
cuenta
area
de
of
tres
conservation
programas.
of OSA,
Como
has
ustedes
three
ven ahí:
programs:
investigación,
investigation,
comunidad y
community,
educación.
and
Y a su vez, estos
education.
tres están
In its way,
rodeando todo
the
el,
three
todo
of
el
them are
momento, a todo
surrounding
momento nuestra misión
the mission,
y se entrelazan.
and they
Me acompaña aquí a
intertwine.
Julia. Julia es la encargada
Julia is here with me.
del
She
programa
is
de
in charge of the education program,
bióloga marina, acompaña
marine
Chantal,
biologist.
encargada también
Chantal
del
also
programa de
is
investigación hoy
in
día.
charge of the investigation program.
Y de esa manera,
And
estos
in that
tres
way,
programas
these three
se van
programs
entrelazando
are
y van
intertwined
dando pasos
and are
en pos de la conservación
going
y
doing
la
positive
conservación efectiva
steps in pro of the
de la
conservation
zona
of the
de Acosa.
area
Así
of
que,
Acosa.
¿dónde estamos? Estamos
Now, where are we? We
en
are
Ojochal,
in
exactamente.
Ojochal, exactly.
Por el norte
In the
tenemos
north,
al Parque Nacional Marino
we can
Ballena,
see
por
the
el sur
National
al
Park
Parque
Marino
Nacional
Ballena,
Corcovado,
in the south
en el medio
Corcovado,
al humedal
in the
Terra
middle
Basierpe, un
Humedal
sitio
Terra
de manglares
Basierpe,
increíble, probablemente el
a
más grande
wetland place in
del
Costa Rica, one
Pacífico
of the biggest ones
tropical.
in the tropical
Y esta
Pacific.
zona
And
es
this
muy importante
area
como
is
sitio de
really
migración,
important
corredor
with
marino
has a
de,
marine
de innumerables
corridor,
especies. Tenemos la visita año
different
a año de
species. We
ballenas
have
jorobadas, como ustedes deben
hunchback
saber.
whales visiting us
Tenemos en el área más oceánica la
in the
Reserva Biológica
oceanic
Isla del Caño, que es uno de nuestros
places.
focos de trabajo.
We have the island of El Caño, which is one of
Y
our
a su
focus
vez
of
esta
work.
zona
And
cuenta con una serie de
with
amenazas, como
this area
hemos
also has a
ido
series of
conversando hoy
risks,
día,
as we've been
como son la presencia de plástico
discussing
tanto
today,
en
the
playas,
presence of
playas que a
plastic
su vez
in the
son sitios
beaches,
importantes
that in the same way
de
they are
migración de tortugas marinas a lo
important
largo de toda la
places
zona.
for tortoises.
Tenemos también
We also have
problemas de calidad de agua
problems
provenientes
of water,
de todos los ríos que desembocan en
of
el
all the
sector.
rivers that
Blanqueamiento de corales tanto en
end
las
up
zonas
in this
costeras
zone,
como en el área biológica de Isla del Caño. Y también
and
efectos
also
de la
the
pesca
effects of the
o
fishing
sobrepesca en
or
muchas de estas
overfishing
zonas.
in all
La
those
siguiente.
places.
Tenemos un centro de
We
conservación
have a
donde en la
conservation
foto de abajo
center,
lo pueden ver,
we can see it
donde
in the
contamos con
picture
un
down
aula del
below,
mar, donde en esta aula se
where
realizan
here
clases
we
para
do
jóvenes.
classes
Vamos a
for
entrar después
people,
un detallito más en lo que es
for
el
young
centro
men. We're going to talk more
de
about the
educación.
Department of Education,
Un laboratorio de
a
investigación que
laboratory
hoy
of
día se está
investigation that
trabajando y
today
nos va a contar Chantal un
is
poco más en
working,
detalle
and
después.
Chantal is going to tell us
Un
more about
laboratorio de
it.
inmunología de corales,
A laboratory of
con lo cual también
monology
estamos
and
trabajando por ahí en una
liberals.
alianza con Racing
We are
Coral.
working in an
por allá.
alliance with Raising Coral over there,
Y también nuestra
and
embarcación que es
also our
bogavante, muy cómoda para
vessel that
poder
is
ir a bucear a la isla del
that is
Caño y
really
también hacer
comfortable
monitoreo,
to
que la verdad
scuba
es
dive
un
and
lujo
make
poder contar con
monitorings,
eso.
and it's a luxury to count with this.
En cuanto a educación,
In education,
en la educación básicamente
education
tenemos un
basically
club
we
de
have a
niños
club
que
of
trabaja
children
semana a
that
semana
work
con
week by
su
week
profesora Julia.
with our professor Julia.
Este club
This club
de
of
educación
education, this education club,
plantea clases teóricas en una
gives
parte, pero
theory
también con actividades muy lúdicas donde los
with
niños se van
ludic
incorporando
activities
y
where
sabiendo de
kids
los
can
conocimientos,
incorporate and get knowledge,
empiezan a manejar una serie de conceptos
and they
increíbles.
start
Julia
understanding
después tal vez
concepts
si
that are
están
incredible.
interesados en esta
One
área
day,
pueden
if you're
acercarse a ella y
interested in this area,
preguntarle,
you
pero
can
ver
come
chicos
here
tan
and
pequeños,
see
tan interesados en
looking at
temas y
children that
manejando
are
conceptos
this young and this
biológicos
interested
o
in
detalles
biological
muy
concepts of
interesantes
species
que
that
son
are
muy
really
motivadores
interesting. They're really motivating,
para la comunidad.
motivating for the community.
Talleres comunitarios, trabajamos tanto con
Communitary
escuelas locales,
workshops. We work
Finca 6, Escuela de
with
Finca 6,
many
Escuela de Bahía
schools,
Ballena.
Ballena
Estamos
School. We
avanzando en
are
esa línea.
advancing in that line.
Y este año
And
empezamos
this
con
year
un
we
club,
started
con
with
un club, no,
a
no es un
club.
club, pero
Well, it's not a club.
un trabajo con los
It's
jóvenes de
work with
Bahía de
young
Araque.
people from Bahía
Bahía de
Draque.
Araque es un área
Bahía
muy
Draque
importante
is an important area
para lo que es
for
la zona turística, es como la
touristic
entrada
area.
hacia
It's
el Parque Nacional
the
Corcovado,
entrance to
zona
Corcovado,
más del sur de Costa Rica.
most
Y
southern
también
part of Costa Rica. And it's
es
also
un sector que está
a
muy
sector
alejado,
that is
por lo
really
cual
far away.
a veces un poco olvidado.
This is why it's sometimes
En cuanto al
forgotten.
trabajo de comunidad,
In the community
contamos con
area, we
expediciones,
have
nos
expeditions.
visitan año a año
We have visitations year by
buceadores,
year from scuba
principalmente
divers
de todo el mundo, vienen
from all
a
over the world
participar
that
con nosotros en una
participate
semana
with us in a
intensa
year of
de
an
buceo,
intense
clases
week
de
of
distintas especies,
scuba
de
diving.
grupos
We
funcionales,
look for
de
different
arrecifes,
species.
biología.
We
Entonces nos
different
bombardeamos
people
una
from
semana
the reef
intensa con
community,
todo esto.
biologist community. It's an intense
Tenemos
week.
pasantías,
We have
nos-
internships.
hasta la fecha llevamos alrededor de
Right now we
30,
have more than
más o
30,
menos 30 internos
30
de
interns
distintas
from
universidades
different
del mundo que
universities
vienen a
of all
trabajar
over
con
the world
nosotros.
that come and work with us.
Monitoreo de la
have
mano del SINAC,
Monitoring
trabajando
the hand with the
directamente
SINAC,
con
working
instituciones del Estado,
directly with institutions of the
donde
state.
vamos con ellos,
We
buceamos
go
con
with
ellos,
them,
hacemos el
we dive in with
monitoreo
them,
juntos
we
y
do the
también
monitoring
muchas
together,
veces también
and
nos
sometimes
capacitamos mutuamente, ¿no
we
es
do
cierto?
the
Ellos
training
tienen mucho que
together.
entregarnos
They have a lot
y
knowledge to give us. We also have
que aprender
lots
de
to
ellos
learn from them
como rangers
as
de
rangers
estas áreas
of
protegidas.
this
Y
protected
piezas de
area,
playa.
and
Y
also
piezas de playa,
cleaning of
actividades
beaches.
que estamos
That's one of the
realizando
activities that
normalmente
we're doing
dos veces
normally twice
al mes,
a
una
month,
en áreas libres,
once in free areas,
áreas públicas, digamos,
public
y otra
areas,
en
let's
áreas
say,
protegidas.
another in conserved areas.
De esta manera
In this
invitamos a la
way, we
comunidad a
invite the
participar de estas
community
actividades y
to make
también nos
part of
involucramos
these activities, and we
con el
also
SINAC en estas
get
actividades de
involved
limpieza.
with SINAC in these
Pero a su vez,
cleaning events.
súper
This
importante
way,
ahí, en las limpiezas de playa recolectamos obviamente toda la
these
basura que podamos
collections, we
encontrar,
get
pero
all
también el
the
plástico.
trash that we
Y
can, but
ahí
also the
estamos
plastic.
trabajando en un
And right
proyecto
there,
muy
we're working
interesante de reciclaje de
with a
plástico que se
project
llama
of
Precious Plastic.
plastic
Ya
recycling
hace
called Precious
recientemente hace unas semanas
Plastic.
tenemos todas las máquinas
And
funcionando
right now we have all the
y
machines working.
me gustaría poder
And
estar
I'd like
sentado
to
aquí en este
be,
momento
I'd love to
en
be
un
sitting right
taburete
here
que hicimos, que lo vamos a
in
traer mañana si es que alguien se queda por acá,
a structure that we are
pero
gonna bring
no lo
tomorrow
pudimos
if
traer hoy
someone
día, que es un
remains.
taburete simplemente hecho de 30
It's made out of
botellas plásticas que
30
recolectamos de la playa.
plastic bottles that
Y
we
eso
gathered from the
no
beach.
pretendemos
And
transformarnos
that
en
is not
una
that
fábrica de
we
plástico,
need to
sino que más
transform
bien es
ourselves into a
el
plastic
reuso de las cosas
factory, but it's the reuse
y
of
ocupar esto como
things
una herramienta de
and
enseñanza
using them as
para las
a
futuras
tool
generaciones.
for knowledge for future
El
generations.
mensaje que les quiero dejar
The
ahí
message that I
solamente es
want to
eso,
leave you is
un
that
poco trabajar en
is working
conservación
in
es trabajar con la
conservation is
gente,
working in
involucrarla, no hay
conservation is
beneficios
working with people,
tanto para las
involving them. There's
universidades
no benefits without
como
the local
para los
communities.
ONG o si no es de la mano de las comunidades
We
locales.
need to do all
Y en
the
esa
work
foto
with the
hay una
community.
niña,
In that
la que
picture, we
sonríe en
can
el medio,
see one
ella es
girl, the
de la
one that's in
comunidad
the
de
middle
jóvenes de
smiling.
Drake, que les
She
comentaba
is from
recién.
the community of
Y las
Traque.
otras dos chicas,
The other
señoras
two
ya,
girls,
son
well,
parte
ladies,
de Aguinadra.
are part of
¿Quién es
Aguinadra.
Aguinadra? Aguinadra es una
Aguinadra is
organización
an organization
de
of
guías de naturaleza de Bahía de
guides,
Araque.
of
¿Y por
nature
qué les
guides
comento
in
esto?
Bahía Drake.
Porque en
Why
el
am I
fondo
commenting this?
esa
Because
es la forma
in
de
the
poder
end, this is
integrarse
the
al
way
trabajo.
of
Nosotros
integrating
llegamos
to
a
the
Bahía
job.
de Araque no a
We
buscar a los niños
go
en su
to
casa, sino
Drake
que
not to look for
vamos,
people at their
nos
house, but we
integramos con la
go
comunidad, con
we integrate them
que
with the
están
community,
trabajando
with
ahí,
the
los que
ones that are
conocen la
working,
zona,
the ones that
y
know
nos
the area,
integramos a través de sus
and we
organizaciones
integrate
locales
them
para poder
in
convocar
local
y
communities so
para
that
poder
we
trabajar de esa
can
manera.
work
Les voy a dejar ahora con
better and have a
Chantal,
bond.
una
I'm going to
chica
leave you with
bióloga
Chantal. She's
de la
a
casa,
biologist
de la UNA,
from the
y
UNA,
que les va a contar un poco
and she's going to talk to us about
sobre los programas de investigación que
the
estamos desarrollando.
investigation programs that we're developing.
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Yo les voy a comentar un
And a
poquito
comment
acerca de
about
los proyectos de
the projects of
investigación que se están
investigation that
realizando hoy día
we
en
are
Oceanas.
right now doing.
Nosotros estamos realizando
We're doing
monitoreos en la
monitorings
isla del
in
Caño,
Isla del
en
Caño,
diferentes sitios
in different
alrededor de la
places.
isla. Acá estamos aplicando lo que
And
es el
here we are
protocolo
doing the
Pronamec.
protocol of
Reunimos
Pronamec.
datos,
We
los
gather
datos de
information,
peces,
what is
invertebrados,
fish,
sustrato.
substrates.
Todas estas giras de
All of
campo
these
van acompañadas de
field
muestras
trips
de
are
calidad del
accompanied
agua.
with samples of water
Tomamos
quality.
análisis de lo que
We
son los
take analysis
nutrientes,
of
pH,
nutrients, pH,
salinidad.
salinity,
Al mismo tiempo, si vemos que ocurre un evento de marea roja,
and if we see that there's
contamos con los
something
rangers
of
del
a red
plancton,
tide, we also know
podemos tomar una muestra
a
y al
sample. We
llegar
gather a
a
sample of the
montañas,
plankton.
instalaciones,
We
analizamos qué tipo
also
de
get to
especies
this
van a estar
to our
comerciando
facilities, and we
este,
can
este
see all the
evento.
species
Con los datos con los que
that
contamos
are
en invertebrados,
that
tenemos
are
otro
making
proyecto de
these
investigación que es la
things happen.
elaboración de un
We are
libro.
doing the elaboration of a book.
En este libro van a poder
In this book,
encontrar
we will
todas las
be able to
especies
find all the,
invertebrados que hemos
the
visto a lo
species
largo del
that we've
monitoreo.
seen in the monitoring,
Inociana también realiza lo que es
and
monitoreo
also
de
in Oceana
cetáceos.
do the monitoring
Entonces,
of
igual, en las
whales.
giras de campo, si vemos
In the field trips,
poblaciones,
we can
tomamos
see
datos,
populations, we see
hacemos
the samples, we
estimación
take
de la cantidad de
informations, we
población,
do accounting of the
comportamiento,
population,
con hidrófono,
we have a hydrophone,
hacemos grabaciones
we look at
acústicas.
the behaviors.
Pero sobre todo en este
But
momento, como ustedes
in this
saben,
moment, as
el
you
gran
know,
declive que está
the
ocurriendo en
great
los distintos
decline that we
organismos,
have in
nuestro
reef,
enfoque principal
our main
en
focus
cuanto a investigación,
in investigation
estamos muy enfocados en lo que es la
is that we are
investigación
really
corales.
focused in the coral
Esto
reef.
va de la mano con
This
modelos de
goes
corales
hand by
3D.
hand with
En eso se
coral
puede ver
models
en
in
línea y
3D.
podemos
You can
ver
see them
toda la
online, we
colonia
can see
de
all the
coral,
whole
podemos
colony of
analizar
coral.
la
We can
enfermedad, si está
analyze the
blanqueado,
disease, if
si
it's
es
whitened, if
sano.
it's a
Y
healthy
uno de
coral.
nuestros mayores proyectos,
And one of our
uno
biggest
de los más
project
importantes
and
es
one of the
inmunología de
most
los corales.
important is
Y
the
justo estamos
immunology
en camino
of the coral reef.
a
Right
llegar
now
a
we're in
ese
our
punto.
way to get to this place.
Para extenderme un
And to
poquito en lo
extend a bit more
que es
in what is
inmunología, los corales,
immunology of corals,
ya se han preguntado,
maybe
han tenido la
you'd ask
oportunidad
yourself if
de
had the
cuando han
opportunity
realizado
when
un
we've had
buceo, un
done a scuba
snorkel
diving or
y
snorkeling,
tenemos un evento de
and we have
blanqueamiento
an event
coralino,
of
en muchas ocasiones
whitening.
podemos ver
In
una
many
colonia de
occasions, we can
coral
see a
sana
colony of
y a la
coral
par
that is
una colonia
healthy
blanqueada.
and one next
Pueden
to
ser
it that
incluso de
is
la misma
whitened.
especie. Lo
Could be
mismo
of the
pasa
same
con las
species. The
enfermedades
same happens
coralinas.
with
Tenemos
coral
corales
disease.
enfermos
We have
y
diseased
al mismo
coral,
tiempo
and at
corales
the
muy
same
sanos.
time,
Y eso se
corals that are
debe a la
really
respuesta
healthy.
inmune
This is because of the
de
immunologic
estos
response
organismos.
of these
Nosotros lo que
organisms.
queremos es
What we want
averiguar
is
cuál es el
to
pico
find
de
out
inmunidad
what's the peak
de estos
of
corales.
immunity of
Para
these
ello realizamos
corals
estas giras
so
de
that
campo.
we can do
Tenemos
these field
corales
trips.
seleccionados
We have
y
selected
queremos ver a
coral
lo
reefs
largo
and we
del
want to
tiempo
see
cómo es la respuesta
throughout
de estos
time what's the
corales.
response of these
No
corals.
precisamente
Not
tiene que ser un
precise,
coral sano,
it
sino
doesn't have to be
incluso
precisely
uno
a healthy
resiliente
coral.
que
It
haya
could be a
podido
resilient
superar
one that
eventos de
can be
enfermedad, eventos de
recovering from
blanqueamiento.
disease or whitening.
Y esto es importante
And this is
por
important
el tema de lo
because
que
of
es
the
la restauración
subject of
coralina, que sería
coral
increíble si
restoration,
podemos
and it would
involucrar
be
más
incredible if we
estudios
could
en este
involve a
sentido,
bit
¿verdad?
more
Moleculares,
studies in
genéticas,
this, in
que nos
genetic,
ayuden
that
a progresar
help us
en estos estudios
to
y que
progress in these
realmente la
studies, and
restauración
that
eh,
restoration
sea más efectiva.
is more effective.
Y aquí les mostramos
And
nuestro
here we show
laboratorio
you
en
our
Ojochal.
laboratory in
Está
Ojochal.
en proceso
It's in the
de su
process
parte
of
para
being
tener todo lo
equipped to have
necesario
all
y
that's
poder iniciar
necessary
con
and
estos
be able
estudios
to
de inmunología.
start with all these processes of immunology.
Y para
Well,
poder
to
realizar
be
este
able
proyecto
to do this project,
tenemos
we have
varias
some
metas. La
goals.
primera es
The
completar
first goal is
todo el equipo necesario para el
to
estudio,
have all the equipment
conseguir
necessary in the
los permisos de
laboratory, all
investigación. Y como algunos
the
saben, es un proceso bastante tedioso.
licenses for
Sin embargo,
investigation, that
ya
you
los
know that
permisos se
it's
han
a
enviado y
tedious
estamos a la espera
process.
de una
We're just
respuesta.
waiting for the response.
Y
And
antes de iniciar con el estudio de
before
corales,
we start with this study
específicamente
of
lo vamos a
corals, we're
realizar
going to
con anémonas.
do it with
Porque, las anémonas se pueden utilizar como organismos modelo, ya que están muy...
anemones, because they can be used as a model of coral,
su proceso es muy
because their
parecido, muy
process is
similar con
similar
los corales, ¿verdad?
as
Son de la misma
corals. They
clase
come from the same
y
class,
se ha visto
and
en varios
we've
artículos
seen in
que
various
ha resultado
articles
muy
that
bien.
it's
Otro dato
responding really
importante
well.
es que
Another
con las anémonas
data is
es
that
mucho
with
más fácil
anemones,
realizar este
it's
proceso
easier to do this process
porque su cuidado es más
because
fácil,
their
es más fácil
maintenance
conseguir los
is
permisos de
easier. It's easier
investigación y para
to
que el
get
equipo se
them,
pueda
and for
entrenar
that the team can
adecuadamente,
be
lo mejor es
trained. The
empezar
best thing is to
con
start with
anémonas y ya
anemones,
una
and
vez
then
preparados,
once
iniciar
they're ready,
con corales.
start with corals.
La idea es,
The idea is
vamos a contar con la
to
colaboración
have
de la
the
doctora
collaboration
Caroline
of Dr.
Palmer.
Caroline
Ella es
Palmer.
experta en los
She's an
temas de
expert in the
inmunología
subject of
y
immunology,
cuando ya
and
contemos con todo lo
when we
necesario,
get
ella va a
all the
venir y nos va
resources,
a
she's
dar
gonna
la
come. She's
capacitación
gonna
para poder
train
iniciar
us
con estos proyectos.
to start with these projects.
Y ahora un
Right
pequeño
now,
video de
a small
Ignacia.
video from Minosiana.
No hay video.
We're having trouble with the video.
Sí. Si gustan en YouTube.
If you like in YouTube, you can find the video.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Chantal.
Thank you
Muchas
so
gracias a
much,
ustedes
Chantal, and thank you all for listening to
La
us.
verdad queríamos compartir
We wanted
este
to
momento
share this moment with you
contarles un poco de
and
la
tell you
experiencia
about the experience of
de Inoceana y
Inosiana,
también
and
abrir
also
las puertas
open the doors
a la
to
comunidad
the community,
académica,
the academic
a
community,
colaborar y
to
también a
contribute,
otras
and
ONG
also other
de
ONG
que estamos disponibles
that we are
para poder seguir
available,
trabajando en conservación.
keep on working towards
Muchas
conservation.
gracias.
Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a escuchar la última
Thank you very
presentación
much, and we'll
acerca de
continue
Tyler.
with our last presentation from Tyler.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
En realidad, lo que quiero hacer con esta
What I would
presentación
like to
es
do with this
contarles un
presentation is
poco
to tell you
acerca
a
del
bit
proyecto MADRE,
about
dentro del
our
cual estamos
master
haciendo esta
project.
investigación.
We
Y
are
después
conducting a
contarles cómo
research,
estamos
and then we
avanzando
would like
y
to tell you
ahí
about how
darles
we're
como sus
starting
resultados
and
de cómo es que
part of the
actividades
results to
internas
see how these
y
types of
calentamiento podrían estar
activities
afectando los
and
ambientes de
how
nuestro
the
entorno.
global warming is
Este
affecting.
proyecto del que les
This
quiero contar se
project
llama Solving Our
is
Cities o Solving
solving the
Sustainability Challenges
sustainability
at the Food
challenges at the
Climate
food climate biodiversity
Biodiversity Nexus.
nexus.
El objetivo
And
principal de
the
este
main
proyecto
goal of this
es ver
project
cómo
is
hacemos
to
para
see
darle de comer al
how
mundo
we can
bajo el
feed the
cambio
world
climático y la
under
pérdida de
climate change
biodiversidad
and
que
the loss of
estamos
biodiversity
experimentando
that we're
en este
currently
momento.
experiencing.
Está siendo liderado
And
por
this
la
is
Universidad de
led by
Columbia
the
Británica
University of British Columbia
y también con la
and
participación y colaboración
also
de
the
la Universidad
participation and
de Costa Rica.
cooperation of Universidad de Costa Rica.
Y bueno, esta
And
pregunta es enorme,
this
¿verdad?
is a
Un
huge question.
proyecto,
Of
por
course,
más
this is
grande
a
que sea,
project
el que
that
dure
no
7
matter
años,
how big it is,
no
it
va a
can
poder
take up to
contestar esta
7 years, so
pregunta.
we won't be able
Entonces,
to
lo
answer
estamos
this
haciendo a través
question.
de un
So we
modelaje
are trying to do
general a nivel
through
global,
general
pero estamos también
modeling,
centrándonos
but we're
en
also
5 casos de
concentrating
estudio
on
diferentes
5 different
allá del
case
mundo.
studies
Uno de estos casos de
worldwide.
estudio es,
One
está en Costa Rica
is here
y nos
in
hallamos
Costa
en el Golfo
Rica,
de Nicoya.
in the Gulf of Nicoya.
¿Puede pasar a la siguiente, por favor?
Can you continue?
Y es difícil tratar
It's
después
hard
de tener
after
estos estudios
having all the
independientes,
independent
cómo
case
tratamos de
studies.
encontrar lecciones
How
en común.
can
Y
we
eso lo vamos a estar
see
haciendo
the
a
things that they
través
have in common, which is
de
something that we are
definir
going to
ciertos
do by
temas
defining
que
some
afectan
topics
en todos los
that are
campos de
present
estudio
in
diferentes.
all the
Entonces,
different
permiten sacar
fields.
conclusiones generales
So we draw some general
como
conclusions,
estas interacciones
like
entre
these
actividades en tierra y
interactions
mar,
and activities
seguridad
both at
alimentaria,
land and at
soluciones basadas en
sea,
ecosistemas
lands interactions, food security,
sostenibilidad y
ecosystem-based
equidad
solutions,
en el
sustainability,
ecosistema.
and
Ahora
equitable
podemos
livelihoods.
pasar, por favor. Perdón. Entonces, ¿por qué
So
escogimos el Golfo
why
de
the
Nicoya?
Gulf of
Y esto
Nicoya?
es porque cuando pensamos
It's because
en
when we
pesquería
think
en
about
Costa Rica,
fishing in Costa Rica,
llegamos a pensar en el Golfo de
we
Nicoya.
think
Aquí
about
es
the
donde
Gulf
se
of
centra
Nicoya because
la
this is
agricultura
where we
que
have
relacionada con el mar
all
y la
culture
marítima
related
desde
to
hace
the sea
miles de años.
for
Todas
many
las comunidades
years now.
costeras
All
dependen o están
the
relacionadas
coastal
con el mar
communities are
porque
related to
su
the
cultura,
ocean. They
su
depend on
comunidad,
it,
su
they
sociedad,
include in
pero
their
en este
society,
momento
their
está
heritage,
enfrentando varios
but
retos
now they are facing
que
different
hacen que
challenges
en el ámbito de seguridad
in
alimentaria,
the food
clima
climate
y
biodiversity
biodiversidad.
nexus.
Y ahora sí, muchísimas gracias. Lo
So,
siento, algo mal pasó ahí. Tal vez en animaciones puede ser eso no debería haberse así. No, ok. Bueno, el mensaje que les
so
quería
the
transmitir en
message
el
that I
slide
wanted to
anterior
convey
era
from the
contarles un
other
poquito
slide
acerca
was
de
to tell you
la
a
historia
little bit
de
about
la
the
pesquería
history
de pequeña
of
escala en el Golfo de
fishing
Nicoya
at small scale in the
que
Gulf of
realmente
Nicoya.
un,
And
bueno,
even though
punto tan localizado,
it's like
de
a
verdad compartir
very
historias con
localized
estudiantes
story
artesanales
with other types of
a través
artisan
de este
fishing worldwide
agotamiento
through
secuencial
this
de los
sequential
recursos
depletion of all these resources and species. And it started with the sharks in 1940s, then it continued with the sardines in the 70s and 80s, and then with it continued with the shrimp in the 90s. And now our current situation,
son recursos
we
pesqueros que
have
están
depleted
agotados y
fishery
están cerca de la
resources,
tragedia
which is
de
affecting
las
the
mismas
quality of life of all
poblaciones.
these communities that depend on this activity.
Y si bien
And
definitivamente este agotamiento
definitely,
de recursos pesqueros
this
se debe a
depletion of
modelos
resources
de manejo
is
así
due
demasiados pescadores
to
para
how
demasiados
we
recursos
have
que
handled this, because we have
juntos
too many
afectan
fishermen and other
pues
additional
a
factors
presionar
that
a
are
conservar
putting
estos ecosistemas.
pressure and
Uno
exacerbating
es
these
la
types of
deforestación de
products,
manglares, la
like
destrucción de
the mangrove
manglares
deforestation, because
simplemente
you
se
know
quedan,
that they
entonces
how
entre
they
más manglares
work. So the
haya,
more
el
mangroves
riesgo
we
de
have,
que
then the
se aprovechan o que sean
populations of
precisamente
fish
más.
can benefit
También
from it.
tenemos
Then
el
we
quiche y
also
el tárcoles,
have
que
at
nos
the Tempisque
dan
and
muchos
Tárcoles,
nutrientes
we have all the
al pulpo
nutrients,
y especialmente en la parte inferior del
and
golfo.
particularly on the
Esto nos
inside of
trae
the Gulf,
desertificación,
which leads
estamos
to
en hipoxia y no
eutrophication,
podemos respirar,
hypoxia,
no se puede respirar,
and
entonces
then you cannot breathe and you cannot
definitivamente
live.
se
So
afecta al
definitely
pez
this is going to
y a los
affect the
pescadores
fish
como el quiche.
and the
Y
fishermen,
bueno,
of
en las
course.
últimas décadas
And
llegan
during
los
the
cambios
last
climáticos
decades,
a
we've seen
acelerar todos los
climate
cambios
change
que
and
están,
how it has
todos
affected
estos estresores que están impactando
and
a los
how it has
ecosistemas, así
impacted
como a los
the
pescadores.
fishing communities.
Entonces, los objetivos
So
climáticos
the
del
goals that we
cártel
would
han
like
destruido
to answer
ecosistemas.
with the case study
Primero,
of Costa Rica are:
cómo es que
first,
las actividades
how
minera
does
y el cambio
land use and climate
climático
change
afectan los
affect coastal
ecosistemas
ecosystems
costeros
and
y las
fisheries?
pesquerías. ¿Cuáles podrían ser
What
algunas soluciones
potential land and
para estas
ocean
cuatro
nature-based
preocupaciones
solutions can we
principales financieras
co-develop
que podrían apoyar y mejorar
with the coastal fishing
la
communities
calidad
in order
de
to
los
improve
ecosistemas
the quality of the ecosystems?
y cómo se
And
debería
also, what should a
estrategia
decision support tool to
integral
identify the most
para
effective and
solucionar
acceptable
tanto efectivas
adaptation
y
options look
más
like?
rentables. Entonces, como podrán ver,
So as you can see,
para contestar estas preguntas,
to answer these
necesitamos
questions,
investigar en
we need
muchísimos
to
aspectos
research.
a la hora de construir nuestro
So
equipo,
now, when
¿verdad?
building our
Pues
team,
contamos con
we
investigadores
have
de disciplinas diferentes.
researchers from different
En general,
areas.
tenemos
In
el
the
componente de
general, we have
modelaje
a
hidrológico,
component of hydrological modeling,
tomando lo que viene del
because they will be modeling what comes from the Tempisque, and we see that how all these land activities might affect the quality of the water in the
Después,
Gulf of Nicoya.
los del cambio
Then
climático
we have
requieren
climate
estudios
change and
de
fishing
profundidad
communities.
marina. Tomamos esta información,
Climate change
basamos
and
en
fishery
estudios para
resources, we
diseñar y
take all
aplicar
the
recursos
information to see what
bajo
changes need to be
diferentes
applied in the Gulf
escenarios
of Nicoya and their
geopolíticos
different
y cómo
scenarios of land use and how this is going to
biodiversidad
impact the marine biodiversity and fisheries.
está
And then
con un
we
equipo
also
de
have a
científicos
team
sociales
of social
encargados de
scientists
llevar esta información
in
y
charge of
contribuyen
conveying
a
this
los
information
procesos
and make it a part of
participativos
all these
con
participating
expertos
process
regionales para
along
hacer
with all the communities
un
in
ciclo
order
de
to
aprendizaje
make
social
this exercise
donde
on social
personas que viven
learning.
ahí en
And
esa
because they live there, they know what
ecosistema
they are going through, they know this
ayuden a
environment,
descubrir las
so
soluciones
they will
cuáles son esas
help us
soluciones
find the
qué
solutions,
podemos
explain
hacer
what the
para
solutions
mejorar la
are,
situación.
and what we can do to support them.
Entonces ahora sí, estaba pensando, ¿cómo comienzo? A mí
So,
me toca la parte de cambio
I
climático,
am in charge
cerca
of climate
de Oceanía.
change, marine
¿Cómo comienzo?
biodiversity, fishing. So, where to
Entonces
start?
comienzo
So,
tratando de entender
I'll
cómo es
try
que el cambio
to
climático
understand how
y los
climate
ecosistemas
change and
han
the land
afectado el
activities
Golfo de
have
Nicoya
affected the
en
Gulf
las
of
últimas décadas.
Nicoya in the last
Y cuando
decades.
estamos hablando de
And
ecosistemas
when we
es
talk
porque
about this in the
tenemos
Gulf
que
of
dividir
Nicoya, I
los
think it's quite
ecosistemas
complex
en dos
because
estados
this is a very closed
donde tenemos que
environment.
sacar tanto
So we need to
recursos
bring
que no
the
nos sirven
tools, and sometimes
utilizar
it's hard to
muchísimo
apply them because we are more limited
la información,
when it
pero
comes
también
to information, but also
recibimos muchos
we
aportes
receive
de los ríos.
important
Entonces
contributions
esto
from
eventualmente
rivers,
nos
so
puede ayudar
eventually this
a esa
might
planificación
help
importante que tenemos
understand what is going on, and we have a team in charge of modeling here at the Gulf of
Lo que
Nicoya.
tenemos
So what we
los
have
datos de
here
movimiento
is
lineal.
a chart
La
that
clorofila
teaches
máxima
that
anual entre
the
el 2003
maximum
y el
chlorophyll
2023
between
para diferentes sitios
2003 and
en el Golfo de
2023 for different types of
Esta
areas in the
línea
Gulf of
roja
Nicoya. And
es la
this
línea que
red
confirma
line
que la
is
región
the
esperaría que
one
haya un riesgo de erosión.
above where you would find
Nosotros vemos
this
que
risk
en
of
todo el
eutrophication.
periodo de los
So
datos,
you
en
see
toda la
in
zona,
all the period
básicamente
throughout the area, there's a high risk of eutrophication and hypoxia.
sí, la tendencia es que
But
está
there
disminuyendo
is a
debido a eso.
trend to decrease.
Sin embargo,
However,
los beneficios
the
asociados
benefits
a esta disminución
associated
en el
to
riesgo de
this
eutrofización
decrease in the risk
pueden
of
ser disminuidos o
eutrophication can
cancelados
be
debido
cancelled
a que
or
también el Golfo ha
they
estado
can be
calentando
decreased
entre
because of the ocean
0.3
warming
y
in the Gulf of
0.7
Nicoya between
máximo
0.28 and
desde la erupción de
0.7. Ocean warming
1985.
since
Y pueden ser
1985, and as you can
muchísimas
see,
variaciones
there are
entre
many variations between the
ejemplo,
estimate for this
entre
warming
eh, el satélite o la
between
fuente de datos que
the
utilizamos.
satellite, for example.
Entonces,
So
muchas gracias. Encontré algo muy
I
interesante que
found
me ha
something
dado
really
esperanza.
interesting that
Y
it
es,
has given
acá lo
me
que nosotros
hope.
tenemos a la izquierda,
And
estoy
to
comparando
the left, I am
simplemente los
comparing
valores de
simply
temperatura
the
observados
data on
versus
temperature that have
los
been
del modelo
observed
predictivo.
versus the one
Aquí
predicted by the model.
incorporamos
And then here
información
we added
acerca
information
de la posición
about
geográfica
the
o sea, la
geographic
distancia al río Tempisco.
position or the
También
distance to
incorporamos
the
información
Tempisque River, and
acerca
we also
de
added
la glaciación,
information
los ríos de lava.
regarding this
Entonces, si ahí me
situation.
mejora
And
muchísimo la
this is
relación.
how we have a better
Como pues pueden
relation
ver con
in
muchas
in
realmente.
this case, and you can take a look
Entonces,
at
esto
this
nos da la esperanza
information,
de que
and this gives
eventualmente,
us hope,
en algún
because
porcentaje,
eventually, if we
se
have
extraiga a través
information
del, del río Tempisque
that we extract from the
cuánta
Tempisque
agua
River,
afecta la
for example,
salinidad,
how much water is
cuánto
going
afecta
to
los nutrientes que tiene
affect the
nuestro
temperature,
ecosistema
nutrients, and
eh,
many other things.
y la distancia al
And
punto
the distance
de
to
entrada de toda
the
esa
point
agua,
of entry of all
pues esa
this
información
water.
en teoría
And with that
podríamos
information,
llegar
in
a
theory, we
corregir
would be
esa
able
información
to
satelital
correct the
y tratar
satellite
de
information
incorporar
and think
información
about using all
como
this
un modelo de
information
6 meses predictivo
as for these
hasta 6 meses
predictive models
anticipación de
6 months
corregir los
in
fenómenos.
advance in order to predict the
Especialmente
heat waves.
podemos hacer esto
And
si
that's
el
something
ciclo
that can be
intertropical
well
puede
done
tener
in
una
the
corrección
Pacific
de
because of
esta
the
información
strongest
y
ratio that we
automáticamente.
have with these
Entonces,
heat
este es
waves.
un punto como de esperanza.
So this gives us some hope.
Y acá también
And
quería
in
entender
here,
cómo
I
es que
wanted
la
to
velocidad
understand
climática
how
cambia en el Golfo. Y
the
esto es
speed
basado
of
con
climate is
datos de
going
temperatura
to
superficial
change with
y
the data on the surface
anteriormente expliqué un
temperature.
poco que la
And
velocidad
we
climática
see that
es
climate
la distancia
velocity
y la
is
dirección
the
que nos
distance
debemos
and the
mover
direction in
para
which we need to move
experimentar
to
las
keep on
mismas
experiencing
condiciones
the
de
same
temperatura
conditions of
de
temperature
estos sitios.
within
Entonces,
these
tenemos
sites. So
muchísima
again,
variabilidad de
we've
acuerdo a
seen
las
a
estimaciones
great
a la fuente de
variability when it
datos
comes to the
que
information
tomamos y
and the
esperamos
data that
que
we
esa
found. So
incertidumbre,
hopefully
esa
this
variabilidad
uncertainty
se
and
pueda reducir
variability
a la
can
hora de
be
corregir los
reduced
datos
when it comes
satelitales
to the
con los
correction of
modelos que
satellite
estamos
data
tratando
on
de
the
obtener
models that we will
del
be
equipo
working with
modelando
and obtain from
hidrológico.
this
Pero por
modeling
ahora
team. But for now,
nos dice que
it
el
tells us
cambio,
that
que la velocidad climática
the
está
climate
dependiendo entre 2 y
velocity
11
is
kilómetros
between
por año
2 and 11
y un
kilometers per
desplazamiento
year,
afuera del Golfo
shifting
y
towards the
dentro
outer
del
Gulf
Golfo
and the
Pacífico.
open ocean.
Y especialmente
And
en el interior del
specifically
Golfo,
when
donde
it
estamos
comes to
viendo
the internal
desplazamientos más
area where
pronunciados
we've seen that this is
estamos
more
observando
pronounced when it comes to
desplazamientos
marine
más
heat waves.
prolongados y entonces va a calentar
So
mucho
it is
más la parte
going
de la
to
parte externa,
warm
mucho más profundo.
much more than the external areas and more in
También
depth.
basada
And
en
also,
la serie de tiempo más larga
based on the
que
longest
pudimos hacer
time
esto,
series that we had for
pude
this,
calcular
I was able to
las
calculate
olas de calor marino
the marine heat
las
waves
olas frías.
and
Veíamos
the cold
que a
spells.
lo largo del tiempo
So throughout the
aumenta
time, and this
la
is going
frecuencia,
to
la
increase in
duración y la
frequency
intensidad
and
de las
duration
olas de
and
calor
intensity of
y
marine heat waves
disminuye la
and
cantidad y
decline
la
in frequency,
intensidad
duration, and
de
intensity
estas
of cold spills that we can experience.
¿Cómo es que esto afecta
And
a nuevas
how is
fechas?
this going to affect the fishing?
Fueron datos tomados
These
por
are
Marviva en el
data
2022
taken
y
by Marviva in 2022 and
tenemos, como
2023
pueden ver ahí
that
arriba,
allows us to see
dice
on
marine heat
top
waves.
where it says
Entonces,
marine
ahí
heat
ven,
waves.
hay un efecto, pero no es
There is
tan
an
grande, no es
effect, but it's
bastante
not
similar al
as
efecto
big. It's similar to the
termoestaciones.
effect of
Entonces,
the season.
uno podría
So
pensar que
maybe, well,
los
you could
pescadores
think
tienen
that
algunos mecanismos
fishermen have
para
some
adaptarse y
mechanisms
que
to try
pueden
and adapt.
utilizar
So maybe we
y,
can
y apoyar
use
para que la
and
actividad
support them for them to keep on adapting to climate change, or then or we dedicate ourselves to observe that the impact of this heat wave that lasted for quite some time.
pero que nosotros vimos el impacto en todo
But
el
we
mundo,
saw
¿verdad?
the impact
Entonces,
throughout the months.
probablemente
So probably
el impacto hubiera sido
the
muchísimo
impact
mayor
could have been
si
even
hubiéramos visto
greater
información
if we
acerca
had
de qué
information
pasó después de
regarding
la
what
temporada de
happened
calor.
after this heat wave
Y
concluded.
muchas gracias.
So thank you very much.
Entonces, en conclusión,
To conclude,
vemos que
we see
parece que los ambientes en el
that
Golfo
it
de
looks
Nicoya
like
y
the
los
Gulf
ambientes
of Nicoya and
impactados o
its environment
afectados
have been
por
impacted
actividades
by
basadas en tierra están en
eutrophication,
marcha. Y es interesante
climate
tal vez
change,
entender un
and
poquito
it's
más
interesting
cuáles
to
serían
understand
los
even
impactos
more what would be the
cuál sería el
impact
impacto de estos cambios
of
sobre
these
la biodiversidad
changes
marina.
on marine
Entonces, ese
biodiversity,
sería el siguiente paso
and that would be the
del
next
proyecto.
step of our
Y
project.
también me interesa
And
muchísimo
I am
explorar
also really interested
ese
in
potencial
exploring this
de
potential
corregir los errores
to correct
la-
all the mistakes we've
las
made
técnicas
so
de
far in satellite
monitoreo
measurements,
para poder
and others
crear
to
herramientas y
try and
soluciones
create
que puedan
the
apoyar
predicting tools that
la
can
mitigación del
support
clima.
the climate adaptation.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.
David, tenemos un
We
espacio de
have a space
preguntas.
for questions and answering.
Si alguno,
I don't know
alguna
if someone
desea.
has a question.
Hola, me llamo
Hello,
Sebastián.
my name is Sebastian.
Tengo una pregunta un
I
poco
have a
abierta
question that is kind
y
of
voy a
open.
entrometer un poco la
Going to
temática de
nose
otra
in
sala,
a
pero
theme
es que
of
me
another
interesa.
subject, another room.
En otra sala estaban
In
hablando
another room,
sobre
they were
cómo
talking about
cerrar un poco la
how to
brecha entre
close the
política y
gap between
ciencia.
politics and
eh,
science.
y pues
And
están en un programa o están
they
ejecución de un programa
in the execution of a
de
program
gestión integral
of
para la zona
integral
costera.
management for the
Mi
coasters.
pregunta es, como
My question is from
desde
your
sus
perspectives
oficinas, desde
or your
sus
offices,
rostreros, digamos, que se puedan poner,
or
¿cuáles aspectos creen
which
ustedes que
aspects
ha
do you think
beneficiado el
benefit
trabajar de forma
working
transdisciplinaria? O
in a
cómo ven
transdisciplinary
no
way?
sé, por ejemplo,
What
cuando
do you
usted no ha
see
trabajado
that,
con
I don't know,
SINAC
when you've
o ha
worked with SINAC,
trabajado,
when you've
bueno,
worked
ustedes
with,
tienen como la parte,
like you guys have the
digamos, de
part
empresa privada,
of
pero también
private
ONG,
enterprise
cómo
or
desde la
ONG,
academia han
or how
modelizado
since the
como
academy have you facilitated
productos y qué aspectos son
products,
los
and what are
claves,
the
digamos, para
aspects
poder
that
mover
are
los productos
key
a que lleguen
to
a acciones
facilitate
a las
products to
comunidades.
so that they become actions in communities?
Es una amplia pregunta, ¿no es cierto?
It's
Bastante
a
larga
big
respuesta también.
question with a big answer.
Creo que
I believe that
el éxito
the
tiene que
success
ver
has to do
con el involucramiento de las
with the
comunidades,
involvement
pero
of
ese
communities,
involucramiento
but
no
that
viene por un
involvement doesn't
mandato,
come through
sino
a
que viene
mandate. It
por
comes
inquietud de ellos mismos.
through an
Y
unease
esa inquietud
inside
de
of
ellos
themselves,
mismos
and that unease,
no es otro camino que
it's
la
not
educación.
nothing
Creo
else
que
but
ese camino
education.
muchas veces, claro,
The way
nosotros
of
no podemos
education, many
resolverlo, tal
times
vez
we
no
can't
vamos a ver los
resolve it.
resultados
We can't see
inmediatos
the results
en nuestras
immediately
generaciones,
in our
pero
generations,
en el largo plazo
but in the longer
ese
term,
es el rol en el
that's
fondo,
the
de
role.
generar un poco esa
Generate
conciencia
a
para que los
consciousness
procesos
so that the
vengan desde
processes
abajo, ¿no es
come
cierto?
from
Desde
below,
el bottom-up, no
bottom up,
top-down, si
not
nosotros
top
queremos
down, if we want
establecer
to
conservación
establish conservations
o medidas
or
muy
measurements
desde arriba hacia abajo, no tienen
up to down low.
ninguna posibilidad
You
de
don't
éxito.
have any
O sea, y
possibility of
conozco en comunidades
success. We've seen
pesqueras, en
that in
procesos de
fishing
conservación marina,
communities of
donde no
marine
hay
preservation where
éxito,
there isn't
que
success
vienen
because
como dictadas desde arriba, ¿no es
they come to a mandate from above, but when the same community sees the necessity to protect, because that's the future, that's the way of life, the success is certain. I'm from Chile.
Hay un ejemplo
An
muy
example
claro
that it's really clear
en la hacienda Juan
in the
Fernández,
archipelagos Juan
un
Fernandez,
proceso de
a
conservación de
process
una
of
comunidad pesquera
conservation of a
catalán
fishing
donde
community where
ellos con 120 años de
they
explotación de
have
langostas mediante
120
trampas,
years
un
of
sistema
lobster exploitation with
muy
traps,
sustentable,
a
han
sustainable
generado un
way.
cambio
They
laboral
generated a
socio-económico
change
en la base de
that
la
they
economía,
all,
pero los
the
jóvenes
base of
están todos en
economy
pos de la
is fishing, but
conservación, de tener
everyone
más
is
áreas marías
imposed of
protectoras, que van a un
conservation,
futuro
to
que
having
son
more marine
sus
areas,
familias, su
because
familia
they've
trabajar
seen
en
it
el
since
mismo
they were
mercado
kids. They've seen their family get
y han visto
involved.
los beneficios
They've
también de la
seen
actividad,
the
no solo
benefits
los
of the
pesqueros,
activity,
sino
not
también
only of fishing,
seguimos
but
siendo
also the
más con eso
tourism begins
todo
to
el beneficio que nos
relate to
trae
that, and all the
en
benefits that
temas
it
de
has
bienestar.
in terms of well-being.
Parece que me extendí un
I
poco.
believe that I extended a bit.
Gracias.
Thank you.
En mi caso, yo
And
creo
in my
que
case, I believe that
reconocer mis limitaciones y
recognizing my
mis puntos
limitations and
fuertes, mis
my
puntos
strong
débiles,
points and
entonces
weak points.
trabajar con un
So
equipo
working with a
que
team that
complementa sus puntos
complements your
fuertes.
points that
Entonces
are
yo
strong.
soy pésima y no
I
tengo la
I don't
capacitación
have
para trabajar en
the
procesos
training
participativos con
for
comunidades,
participating with
trabajarme desde
communities, to
dentro
be
con,
in
con el
reunions,
con
constant
gobierno y
reunions,
todo
or
eso
meeting with
difícil, pero
government,
transferir una
because
idea
to transfer
clara,
an idea that
pero
is
estoy
clear,
trabajando
but
con
I'm working
personas
with
que
people
sí lo
that do,
hacen
and
y esta traducción de
there's a
ciencia
translation of science
a algo que es actionable, como
to
dijeron
something
hoy en la
that is
mañana,
actionable,
y algo que todos podemos,
something
y
that
definitivamente es algo que
everyone
todavía
can
no lo he logrado al 100%,
can do,
pero
is
que
something that we still
espero
can't
con estas
manage, but we
oportunidades,
believe
estos
that with these
proyectos
opportunities,
y
these
trabajar
projects,
con
we and
empresas y
working with the
sistemas
people
y
from
estudios, nos
other
permita
areas
mejorar en
helps us
procesos necesarios.
become better, because it's necessary.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Any other question
Okay.
Igual para Taylor,
for
tenía
Taylor?
la curiosidad de que
I had a
usted
curiosity that you
mencionara el
mentioned that
proceso
there was a
luego de
diminishment of eutrophication through time. Do you have any idea of why?
cualquier cosa, me dijeron sería como una
Right
especulación
now,
antes de que
everything would
tengan
be
los resultados
speculation
biológicos,
before
lo
we
que
have the
está
results from
pasando
the
entre
laboratory. What's happening
a
in
nivel
between
de
in the
precipitación,
level of
que ahora se sabe que
precipitation?
tal vez
I
hay
thought
menos
that it
agua
could
que
be
está
less
entrando
water
por
that is coming through
Tempisque,
Tempisque,
pero
but they say no, no,
no es
no.
que hay menos
It's
agua,
not
es
that
que hay
there's
una
less
mayor
water, it's that
variabilidad.
there's more variability.
Entonces, tal vez
So
en estos
maybe
10 años ya
in
no
these
se,
10
la
years we see
tendencia
that the
se está
tendency
disminuyendo,
is
pero tal vez
diminishing.
tenemos un
But
escenario de
maybe
150, 60 años,
we
tal vez
have
está aumentando
from
o es
50 to 60
estable,
years it's
pero
augmenting,
lo
or
que han
it's
visto es un
stable, but what
aumento
they've
en la
seen is that
variabilidad.
there's an increase in
Entonces,
variability.
esa era mi teoría,
So
pero
this
falló
is my theory,
increíblemente.
and it
Entonces,
failed
no
horribly.
tengo
So
por el momento
right
no te
now I
puedo decir
don't have,
por qué, porque es algo
because
que queremos ver, ¿verdad?
it's
Entonces,
something we
¿qué
want to see.
hicimos?
So what did we do?
Empezamos y
We need
hicimos
to
para
understand
ver
what we do
si
to see
podemos
if we can
amplificar esos resultados.
amplify those results.
Excelente, bueno,
Excellent.
buenísimo.
Okay,
Creo
so
que
I
si no hay
think that
alguna otra
there's
pregunta
no
más,
any
damos
more
por
questions. We
finalizado este panel. Les
finalize this panel.
agradezco
I want to
muchísimo a
thank
todas las
you
personas
so
que
much for
participaron,
everyone
por
that
su tiempo y
presented, for your
dedicación
time, your
e
dedication,
ideas
and your
en este
ideas
panel.
in this
Muchas
panel.
gracias.
Thank you so much. Y a los traductores.
Sin ellos no hubiéramos podido hacer nada.
No hubieran podido hacer nada. Nada podían hacer. Listo, eso entonces ya.
Y yo creo. Hay que preguntar a los otros cómo van. Yo me vine con Mauro. No sé cómo andarán. ¿O te toca venir mañana aquí?
Me acabo
acaban de preguntar, estoy viendo si lo logro. A ver si lo puedo afuera.
Sí, voy a ver qué se hizo. Maureen.
Si vos vas saliendo, yo te espero.
Ah, tranquilo, tengo que esperar a Maureen.
Sí.
Porque como me vine con ella.
Bueno, muchísimo gusto.
Igual un gusto. Nos vemos, que te vaya bien.
Igual.
Chao.